Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we're stepping into the quiet power of a man who never shouted, never bragged, and yet controlled the underworld with the calm precision of a chess master. His name was Carlo Gambino, the Quiet Godfather of the American Mafia. A man who rose from the dusty streets of Sicily to become one of the most powerful crime bosses in American history. Not through violence or chaos, but through patience, discipline, and an almost invisible hand that shaped the Mafia for decades. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it right now? We love seeing how far this underworld stretches across countries and time zones. And hey, if you enjoyed disappearing into the shadows with us, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and tap the bell so you never miss a story from Outlaw Icons. Now, take a deep breath, let the noise of the day fade away, and prepare to step into a world ruled not by bullets, but by silence. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1. The Sicilian Beginnings, 1902 to 1921. The sound of the sea was the only witness that morning, waves licking against the worn stone of Palermo's harbor, as if whispering secrets they'd carried for generations. A young boy stood there, no more than 19, his face half-lit by the dawn. His eyes didn't flinch when the gulls shrieked overhead or when the salt stung his skin. Behind him, Sicily, a land of sun and silence, of loyalty and blood. Ahead of him, the unknown. That boy was Carlo Gambino, and he was about to vanish from one world and step quietly into another. But before he became the Quiet Godfather, before America ever learned his name, he was just a small shadow in a place where men measured power not by words, but by who was willing to keep them. Carlo was born in the year 1902 in Palermo, into a family that understood the language of silence long before he could even speak. His parents, honest enough by appearance, were tied by blood and tradition to the local mafia in the town of Cosa, a place where honor was currency and betrayal carried a death sentence. The Mafia wasn't yet the sprawling criminal empire Americans would come to know. In Sicily, it was still something older, something deeply cultural. It was the shadow government of the poor. When a state couldn't protect you, the Mafia could. For a price. In the sun-baked hills of Cosa, young Carlo watched the world through narrow alleys where deals were sealed with nods instead of signatures. He learned early that trust was a myth, and silence was survival. There was no need for lectures. A child could see what happened to men who spoke too much. They disappeared. Their houses burned. Their names became ghosts on the wind. Carlo was quiet, observant, unervingly calm, traits that would define him for the rest of his life. Other boys chased soccer balls through the dust. Carlo followed his uncles to the vineyards, listening as they discussed who owed what, who respected whom, and who didn't. They never said the word Mafia. It was always the friends. The Cosa Nostra, our thing. It was spoken like a sacred oath. In that world, omerta wasn't just a rule, it was a religion. Silence was holiness. To break it was to sin. Carlo absorbed this code like breath. When soldiers came through the villages collecting taxes or rounding up young men for service, Carlo saw how the old men would nod respectfully but obey only when it suited them. The true power wasn't in the government. It was in the men who could make a problem disappear without ever raising their voices. The turn of the century brought storms to Sicily, not of weather, but of power. The Italian government wanted control, and the Mafia resisted in the shadows. Feuds burned through towns like brush fire, quiet but deadly. Each week, another name whispered dead. By the time Carlo was a teenager, he already understood the balance of fear that held everything together. He never said much, but people remembered his eyes, cold, deliberate, calculating, like he could see further down the road than anyone else. Even as a boy, he didn't rush. He studied. When older boys fought, he watched. When men argued, he listened. That patience, that refusal to act until the perfect moment, became his greatest weapon. Then came the war. The Great War, they called it. The first one. The sound of cannons from Europe reached Sicily, as rumor and dread. Italian soldiers were drafted in waves, and the countryside emptied of its young men. Some never came back. The Mafia, sensing opportunity, grew stronger. It filled the vacuum left by the state, offering protection and jobs at a cost. Carlo's family, like many, relied on them to survive. But something darker was stirring. After the war, a new figure rose in Italy, Benito Mussolini, a man with steel eyes and iron fists who promised to restore order by any means necessary. To Mussolini, the Mafia wasn't tradition, it was a disease, and he would cure it with terror. He sent Cesare Mori, the Iron Prefect, to Sicily with orders to crush the Mafia. Mori's raids were brutal. Homes were stormed in the night. Men were dragged into the streets and beaten until they talked. Whole families vanished. The code of silence was tested like never before. For the first time, the Mafia wasn't untouchable. It was hunted. And for a boy like Carlo Gambino, now entering manhood, that meant choosing between staying loyal to the old world or surviving in a new one. By 1921, the pressure was unbearable. The Sicilian hills that once whispered safety now echoed with the boots of soldiers. Carlo's uncles were under watch, friends imprisoned, and whispers spread that Mori would not stop until every last man of honor was either jailed or dead. The old men called it the end of an era. Carlo called it a sign. One night, under the dim glow of a kitchen candle, his mother packed a small bag. Bread, cheese, a photograph. She didn't cry, but her hands trembled. "Go," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. "There is nothing left for you here." His father didn't look up. He simply nodded, his silence saying what words could not: "Make your name elsewhere." So Carlo Gambino left the only home he'd ever known. He walked the dirt road from Caccamo to Palermo with a coat too thin for the wind, carrying no fortune, no letters of recommendation, just a name that, in certain circles, still meant something. The dock smelled of salt and sweat, packed with other young Sicilians fleeing the same storm. They didn't speak much, but their eyes all said the same thing: America. The land where the past could be buried, and a man could build an empire from nothing. The ship was called the SS Vasari, a rusted, steel beast that carried hundreds across the Atlantic. The voyage lasted weeks. The air below deck was thick with sickness, fear, and the sour smell of hope. Families clung to each other in the dark, praying their sacrifices would buy them a better life. Carlo didn't pray. He watched. He studied the faces around him. Desperate men, gamblers, dreamers. Some would work the docks. Others would vanish into the alleys of Brooklyn and never be seen again. He was already thinking ahead. America wasn't a promise to him. It was an opportunity. One night, during a storm, the ship pitched so hard the sea swallowed the stars. The passengers screamed as water slammed against the hull. Carlo sat still, clutching the railing, feeling the ocean test him. Around him, people wept. But in his stillness, something was born, that cold patience that would define him forever. In chaos, he found control. Weeks later, the horizon cracked open with a pale light. New York. The Statue of Liberty, rising through the fog like a ghostly promise. The passengers rushed the decks, crying and cheering. Carlo just watched, expressionless. He wasn't seeing freedom. He was calculating power. Ellis Island was chaos, shouting in a dozen languages, children crying, inspectors barking orders. Immigrants shuffled through lines, holding their few possessions like shields. When it was his turn, the officer asked his name. Carlo Gambino, he said softly, his accent thick. The officer scribbled something on a form and waved him through. That was it. No fanfare, no welcome, just a nod, and he was in. Outside, the city was roaring. The skyline cut the clouds like blades of light. The streets of Lower Manhattan were crowded with horse carts, smoke, and the constant rhythm of footsteps. To a 19-year-old Sicilian who had grown up in silence, it was like stepping into a living machine. Every block was moving, breathing, hustling. Carlo followed a cousin's address to Brooklyn, the neighborhood of Castellammarise, where Sicilian immigrants had built their own little world. The air smelled of garlic, coal, and ambition. Every corner had a story, every stoop a watcher. Here, men spoke in low voices about business, about protection, about loyalty. It wasn't Sicily, but it was close enough. His cousin introduced him to a man named Salvatore D'Aquila, one of the first Mafia bosses in New York. D'Aquila ran his operation with iron discipline, and he recognized something familiar in the quiet young man who didn't talk much, but noticed everything. He gave Carlo small jobs, collecting payments, delivering packages, watching. Carlo did them all without a word. He never took more than he was owed, never drew attention. In a world full of loud men, his silence stood out. People underestimated him, thinking he was just another immigrant kid trying to make rent. But D'Aquila saw the stillness behind his eyes, that rare kind of composure that made people either trust you or fear you. Within months, Carlo was running small crews, learning the American system the way he had learned the Sicilian one, slowly, invisibly. Yet, even as he adapted to the streets of Brooklyn, he never forgot the hills of Cacamo, the way the sun set on stone houses, the quiet lessons of power learned in whispers. The Cosa Nostra might have been born in Sicily, but in America, it was evolving, becoming something bigger, bolder, more profitable. And Carlo understood that before most. He spent his nights walking the docks, watching the cargo ships unload, memorizing who controlled what, the unions, the foremen, the bribes. He saw how the Italians, Irish, and Jews divided the streets like chess players dividing a board. Every move mattered. Every alliance came with a price. It wasn't just about who had the gun. It was about who knew when not to use it. Sometimes he'd write letters back home, though fewer each year. Sicily had become a memory. America was the new game. But in those letters, he always signed the same way. Il silenzio e potere. Silence is power. No one in those early days could have known that this quiet young immigrant would one day sit atop the entire American Mafia, that his name would echo in the halls of power and fear alike. But if you watched him then, the way he moved through the crowd, unnoticed yet unforgotten, you might have guessed it. Because Carlo Gambino didn't conquer America with violence. He conquered it with silence. And as the ships kept arriving, spilling thousands more into New York's crowded streets, the quiet boy from Cacamo was already weaving himself into the city's underworld. One deal, one handshake, one secret at a time. By the time the decade would end, blood would flow through Brooklyn like spilled wine. Wars were coming. Empires were about to collide. But in the middle of it all, one man would remain calm, patient, deliberate, invisible. He was watching, waiting, listening for the moment when silence would become power. And soon, that moment would come. Chapter 2. Landing in America. The young immigrant in Brooklyn. The first winter wind in New York cut through the thin wool of his coat like a knife. But Carlo Gambino didn't shiver. He stood on a Brooklyn street corner, watching the snow turn to slush beneath the boots of dock workers. The city was alive in ways Sicily never was. Louder, faster, harder. Smoke from the factories clung to the rooftops. The air smelled of iron and ambition. Horses clattered down the cobblestone streets. Vendors shouted in half a dozen languages. And children darted through the crowd chasing after dreams they'd never catch. To Carlo, it all sounded like music. The sound of opportunity. He found a small room in a tenement near the Brooklyn waterfront, its walls so thin he could hear every cough, every prayer, every argument from the families packed around him. At night, the streetlights flickered through the cracked window, painting his ceiling in pale orange. He couldn't sleep much. The city didn't allow it. Even silence had weight here, a kind of restless hum that never stopped. But for a boy who had come from a world ruled by whispers, that constant noise was strangely comforting. It meant he was still invisible, still safe. Every morning, he walked to the docks where ships arrived from Europe loaded with cargo and human stories. The men there worked like machines, their backs bent, faces blackened with soot, moving crates for pennies. Carlo joined them without complaint. He was small but wiry, quick with his hands, never idle. The foreman liked him. He didn't talk back. didn't ask questions. And when he took his pay, he counted it once, nodded, and left. No arguments. No trouble. But beneath that quiet obedience was calculation. He studied how the docks operated, who handled the money, who handled the men, and who handled the problems that couldn't be solved by the police. In those early years, the docks weren't just a workplace. They were the veins of New York's criminal network. Everything passed through them: goods, information, and power. The men who controlled the docks controlled the city's heartbeat. It didn't take long for Carlo to notice them. The ones who didn't lift crates but still got paid. Well-dressed Sicilian men who strolled along the waterfront with cigarettes dangling from their lips, speaking softly, always with respect, always with someone else carrying their coat. They weren't part of the dockworkers' union. They were something older, something he recognized from home. One of them approached him one afternoon, a man named Salvatore D'Aquila, tall and composed, with eyes like cold marble. He was already a powerful boss in New York, running the remnants of the Sicilian Mafia that had taken root in America decades earlier. He saw something in the young man who never looked away, never flinched, and never spoke out of turn. "You work hard," he said, his Sicilian accent still heavy. "That's good. Hard work is honest work. But sometimes, honest work is not enough." Carlo said nothing. He didn't need to. D'Aquila smiled faintly. "You understand," he said. And Carlo nodded. Within weeks, Carlo wasn't lifting crates anymore. He was running small errands, delivering envelopes, collecting payments, carrying messages between men who trusted only other Sicilians. It was a slow initiation into a world he already understood instinctively. There were no ceremonies, no blood oaths yet, just quiet observation. Trust came gradually, like a drop of water carving through stone. And Carlo had all the patience in the world. In the evenings, he sat at a small cafe on Knickerbocker Avenue, where men spoke in code and shared stories of the old country. They called it the family, but everyone knew what that meant. Rules were few but absolute: respect, loyalty, silence. Omerta. Those who broke it didn't just die. They disappeared, erased so thoroughly that even their names were whispered with caution. Carlo listened more than he spoke, earning a reputation for calm and discipline that older men found unnerving. He was still barely 20, yet he carried himself like someone twice his age. The world around him was changing fast. Prohibition had just begun in America, turning liquor from a legal business into the most profitable crime in history. The Volstead Act, passed in 1920, was meant to purify society, but all it did was hand control of alcohol to the underworld. Bars shuttered by day reopened as speakeasies by night. Police officers took bribes with one hand while raiding the same bars with the other. In that chaos, fortunes were made overnight. Carlo saw it coming before most did. He saw how Sicilian, Irish, and Jewish gangs began carving up the city like wolves dividing prey. To him, bootlegging wasn't just about smuggling liquor. It was about organization. Whoever mastered the network would control everything: transport, distribution, profit, protection. D'Aquila's men were already in the game, but disorganized. They were strong but noisy, violent but sloppy. Carlo kept his distance at first, watching from the edges, learning who led and who followed. He saw the difference between the Sicilian way and the American way. In Sicily, power was quiet. Men ruled through reputation and respect. In New York, power shouted. It dressed in silk suits and shot rivals in daylight. But Carlo knew noise drew attention, and attention led to ruin. He made a choice early on. He would rise, but he would rise unseen. He started small, organizing shipments of wine disguised as olive oil. Whiskey hidden in crates marked machinery. He didn't brag about it. He didn't drink from his own supply. He made sure everyone got paid on time, and no one got cheated. That reliability built trust faster than fear ever could. The older men began to lean on him for advice, and soon, even D'Aquila noticed. By 1922, Carlo Gambino was a name quietly respected in Brooklyn's underworld. He wasn't rich, not yet, but he had something more valuable: connections. The Sicilian bosses trusted him. The American gangsters underestimated him, and the police didn't even know his face. He had found his place in the shadows. But shadows in Brooklyn were getting darker. The streets buzzed with rumors of a brewing war among the city's Italian gangs. Joe the Boss Masuria on one side, Salvatore Maranzano on the other. Two powerful men who wanted total control. The tension was everywhere, in the cafes, in the whispers at the docks, in the way men began to carry pistols under their coats. For Carlo, it was déjà vu. He'd seen this story before in Sicily. Ambition turning brothers into enemies. And he knew how it ended. Still, he didn't pick a side too soon. That was his gift, the ability to wait until others made mistakes. He kept his loyalty close and his motives closer. Men would come to him asking, "Which way will you go, Carlo?" He'd shrug, smile faintly, and say, "I'll go where the wind doesn't blow dust into my eyes." That caution saved his life more than once. When the killings started, restaurant shootings, car bombs, disappearances, Carlo kept his head down. He moved money, not bullets. He arranged shipments, kept books clean, and quietly learned the art of invisibility. Even among killers, he was respected as a man who could be trusted not to speak, not to boast, not to betray. He began to build relationships beyond D'Aquila's circle. Men like Frank Costello and Vito Genovese, ambitious figures who saw in Carlo a mirror of their own ambition, only quieter. They talked about uniting the Italian gangs under one commission, one system. At that time, it was a fantasy, but Carlo listened carefully. He knew that real power wasn't seized overnight. It was built brick by brick, deal by deal. He rented a small office above a bakery that fronted for illegal whiskey distribution. Every afternoon, he'd sit by the window with a cup of espresso, watching the trucks roll out under fake invoices. He had a notebook, simple, worn, the kind you'd never notice. Inside, he recorded every shipment, every name, every debt. To most, it was bookkeeping. To Carlo, it was control. Knowledge was leverage, and leverage was power. As the years passed, his network grew quietly. No newspapers mentioned his name. No witnesses testified against him. While others flashed their wealth with cars and suits, Carlo wore the same dark coat, the same modest hat. He blended into the crowd so seamlessly that even those who worked for him sometimes forgot to fear him. But when they saw his eyes, they remembered. He lived simply in a small apartment with his cousins, sending money home to his parents in Sicily. He never spoke about his dreams, but the men around him could feel them. He wasn't chasing riches or fame. He was building something enduring, a foundation that could outlast bullets and betrayals. He'd seen what pride did to men back home. It made them reckless. He would be different. He would be patient. One cold evening, a man was found dead behind a bar in Red Hook, a rival bootlegger who had crossed D'Aquila's men. The newspapers called it another gangland killing, just one of dozens that year. But among the Sicilians, whispers said the order hadn't come from D'Aquila. It had come from the quiet one, the boy from Cacamo who didn't talk much but always got results. Whether true or not, the rumor spread. And with it, his legend began to grow. By the mid-1920s, New York's underworld was a powder keg. Every boss wanted more. More territory, more profit, more soldiers. And standing quietly among them was Carlo Gambino, still young, still patient, waiting for the right crack in the wall. He learned one thing from both Sicily and America. Power wasn't about who pulled the trigger. It was about who made sure the gun was never pointed at him. He often walked the Brooklyn Bridge at night, watching the lights of Manhattan shimmer across the river. To him, the skyline wasn't beauty. It was a map of opportunity. Each building, each street, each union was a piece of the puzzle. He could see the empire forming already, though he didn't know yet that it would bear his name. One night, as he stood there with the wind cutting across the East River, a friend asked him quietly, "Carlo, what do you want out of all this? Money? Respect?" Carlo looked at him, calm as ever, and said, "I want to never have to raise my voice." It wasn't arrogance. It was prophecy. He understood something most gangsters never did. That real authority whispers. Men who shouted their power were already losing it. Silence could build empires. By the decade's end, the Castellamarese War would erupt full force. Bosses would die, alliances would shatter, and the Mafia itself would be reborn. But for now, the young immigrant from Cacamo was quietly laying bricks in the foundation of a future empire. He was a ghost in plain sight, moving money through hands, keeping accounts clean, avoiding every spotlight. The police barely knew his name, and those who did dismissed him as unimportant. That was exactly how he wanted it. And as the sound of bootleg trucks rumbled through Brooklyn nights, Carlo Gambino sat by his window, smoke curling from a cigarette, eyes steady on the dark streets below. He had crossed an ocean, escaped a dictatorship, and survived among predators by saying almost nothing. The city didn't know it yet, but the boy who once carried crates on the docks was already shaping the course of its underworld. He was patient. He was invisible. And soon, when the blood began to flow and the old guard started to fall, he would be ready to take his first true step into power. The streets of Brooklyn never slept. Neither did he. Chapter 3. The Castellamarese War, 1929 to 1931. It began, as all underworld wars do, with whispers. Quiet insults traded between men who once dined at the same tables. Subtle shifts in loyalty. A glance too long. A handshake that never came. By the end of it, the streets of New York would run red. The Mafia itself would be forever changed, and Carlo Gambino, still quiet, still watching, would step out of the smoke with more power than anyone realized. The year was 1929, and America was unraveling. The stock market had just crashed, sending the country into chaos. Men who once owned skyscrapers now stood in bread lines. But while Wall Street fell, another economy thrived, the one built on whiskey, gambling, and fear. Prohibition had made the Mafia rich beyond imagination. Every corner of New York buzzed with bootleg liquor. Every bar was a speakeasy. Every cop was on someone's payroll. Money flowed like water, but it came with blood in the mix. The more they earned, the more they wanted. And in that greed, the seeds of war took root. At the top of New York's Mafia stood Joe the Boss Masuria, a stocky, cigar-chewing brute who believed the old Sicilian way still ruled America. He ran his family like a feudal lord, demanding tribute from every smaller crew. If you were Italian and wanted to breathe in New York's underworld, you paid Joe. He'd started as a street thug, but through sheer violence and intimidation, he'd clawed his way to the top. His enemies called him arrogant. His friends called him invincible. But in the shadows, another man was watching, a man named Salvatore Maranzano, a Castellamarese from Sicily who believed Masuria was unfit to lead the new world. Maranzano was different, educated, disciplined, even charming in his own calculating way. He wanted to remake the Mafia, not as a loose collection of gangs, but as an empire, structured, organized, unstoppable. To him, Masuria was a relic. And to men like Carlo Gambino, who had seen what pride did to fools, that made Maranzano's vision worth listening to. At first, Carlo stayed neutral. He'd learned in Sicily that early loyalty in a war was a dangerous thing. He continued to work his small rackets in Brooklyn, moving liquor quietly through the docks, never making headlines. While others shouted allegiance, he observed who was truly winning. But the whispers grew louder, and soon there was no neutral ground left to stand on. The first killings were almost polite. Small-time lieutenants found shot in their cars, messages sent through the language of bullets. But by the spring of 1930, the violence was everywhere. Speakeasies exploded in daylight. Trucks full of whiskey went missing. Corpses turned up in alleys with notes pinned to their jackets. Masuria sends his regards. Maranzano says hello. New York became a chessboard soaked in blood. Carlo's crew kept their distance, moving product under fake permits, operating behind shell companies that paid taxes on time and kept police off their scent. He avoided open conflict, knowing full well that whoever survived this war would need men like him. Men who kept things running when the streets were chaos. In quiet rooms, he met with Maranzano's allies. Men like Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, and Frank Costello, young and hungry leaders tired of the old ways. They saw in Gambino a reflection of themselves, modern, patient, business-minded. Luciano especially understood him. Both men shared the same instinct: control through silence, dominance without spectacle. One night, in a smoke-filled apartment, Luciano leaned back and said softly, "This city's too small for dinosaurs like Joe the Boss. We need men who can think." Carlo didn't answer right away. He simply looked up, expressionless, and said, "Then make sure when the dinosaur falls, the ground doesn't shake too much." Luciano smiled. He knew what that meant. Gambino wasn't against Masuria. He was against chaos. The war dragged on through the winter. Newspapers called it the Italian crime wave, though most of the killings went unreported. The cops didn't care. The politicians were paid to look away. For ordinary people in Brooklyn and Manhattan, it was just another season of fear. But for the men involved, it was a test of survival. Every meal might be poisoned. Every handshake might hide a blade. Carlo began using safe houses throughout the city, never sleeping in the same place twice. He sent coded messages through couriers, numbers, not names. To his men, he gave simple orders: stay quiet, stay invisible, and let the fools kill each other. In times of war, patience was the deadliest weapon. Masuria grew paranoid. He trusted no one. He demanded tribute from his soldiers and punished hesitation with death. Some said he could feel the ground shifting beneath him, but didn't know where to run. Maranzano, on the other hand, grew bolder, claiming territories in the Bronx and Brooklyn, forming alliances with Luciano's faction. It was no longer a feud between two men. It was a civil war inside the Mafia. By early 1931, everyone could feel the end coming. The question wasn't who would win. It was who would still be standing when the dust settled. That's when the whispers turned into plans. Luciano, always the strategist, approached Gambino quietly through intermediaries. They met in a small cafe, away from the familiar neighborhoods, speaking low over espresso. Luciano explained his vision: a mafia no longer ruled by one boss of bosses, but by a commission, a council of equals, each with their own territories, each bound by profit, not ego. A system that could prevent wars instead of causing them. Carlo listened, silent as ever. He had no love for Masuria, but he was careful not to rush. "If you want to build something lasting," he said finally, "you must first destroy the idea that one man can own it." Luciano nodded. "That's exactly what I plan to do." The plan to kill Joe Masuria was simple, brutal, and flawless. On April 15, 1931, Masuria agreed to meet Luciano for lunch at a small restaurant in Coney Island. He thought it was a truce. Luciano excused himself to the restroom midway through the meal. Moments later, four gunmen entered and opened fire: Genovese, Anastasia, Costello, and a young man named Bugsy Siegel. Masuria died with playing cards still in his hand, his blood soaking into the tablecloth. It was over, or so everyone thought. With Masuria gone, Maranzano declared himself the new Capo di Tutti Capi, boss of all bosses. He reorganized the families, set up territories, even introduced military-style ranks. On paper, it looked like order. In reality, it was dictatorship. He demanded tribute from every family, just as Masuria had. He talked about honor and tradition, but his methods were pure tyranny. He even began drawing up a list, a secret one, of young leaders he planned to eliminate before they could challenge him. On that list were Lucky Luciano and Carlo Gambino. It was a fatal mistake. Luciano realized they'd only traded one tyrant for another. The very men who had helped Maranzano rise now plotted to end him. But they needed someone who could move quietly, someone who understood the value of subtlety. Gambino was their man. While others schemed loudly, he mapped Maranzano's habits, his guards, his meetings. It was a dance of precision, and Carlo orchestrated it like a silent conductor. On September 10, 1931, Maranzano was holding court in his Manhattan office when the door opened and four men entered, posing as federal agents. They told his guards to leave, claiming they were there for an inspection. Seconds later, the sound of gunfire cracked through the walls. When it stopped, Salvatore Maranzano was dead, stabbed and shot multiple times. The Castellammarese War, after 2 bloody years, was finally over. The news hit the underworld like thunder. For the first time, there was no boss of bosses. Luciano's dream of a commission became reality. The Mafia was reborn, not as a chaotic collection of gangs, but as a structured, nationwide corporation of crime. And in that structure, Carlo Gambino found his perfect niche. He was rewarded for his loyalty and foresight, brought deeper into the inner circle of the future. Luciano admired him for his discipline. Anastasia trusted him with his life. Costello called him the man who speaks like a priest and thinks like a banker. But Gambino remained exactly as he had always been: quiet, deliberate, unreadable. He didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He simply moved forward, as if the bloodshed had been nothing more than another chapter in a long story he already knew the ending to. The city was changing fast. The Great Depression had emptied pockets and hardened hearts. Crime became a business of necessity, not luxury. The Mafia stepped into that void, providing jobs, loans, and protection where the government couldn't. They were criminals, yes, but to many Italian immigrants, they were also saviors. And Gambino understood that duality better than anyone. He wasn't just building a criminal enterprise. He was building legitimacy. In the months that followed, he focused on labor racketeering, controlling unions, shipping, and construction contracts. The docks that once broke his back now bent to his will. The same foremen who'd paid him pennies now paid him tribute. But he didn't rub their faces in it. He remained polite, almost humble. His power grew not through fear, but through reliability. He made sure everyone earned something, and in return, they kept his name out of their mouths. The end of the Castellammarese War had created a new kind of mafia: organized, efficient, disciplined. And in that order, men like Carlo thrived. He had survived 2 wars, one in Sicily, one in New York, without ever firing a shot in public. While others built reputations on violence, he built his on restraint. It became his signature, his myth. The quiet one, the man who could stand in a room full of killers and command more respect with silence than they could with guns. But peace, even in the underworld, is temporary. Power attracts ambition. Ambition breeds betrayal. And in the shadows of this fragile new order, future storms were already brewing. Gambino could feel it, the same way he once felt the wind shift on the Sicilian hills. The names would change, the faces too, but the game would always be the same. Whoever stays quiet longest wins. As night fell over Brooklyn, he walked along the waterfront where the lights from Manhattan shimmered across the river. He lit a cigarette and watched the smoke twist into the cold air. The war was over, but the silence afterward felt heavier than gunfire. Somewhere in that silence, he could already hear the echoes of what was coming. Alliances breaking, friends turning, another generation of blood ready to spill. He didn't fear it. He welcomed it. Because Carlo Gambino understood better than anyone that power was not taken by force. It was inherited by those patient enough to wait for everyone else to destroy themselves. The Castellammarese War had ended with one king dead and another born. But the man who truly won it all was neither. It was the quiet immigrant from Caccamo, the one who spoke rarely, acted carefully, and saw further than anyone else. He slipped his hands into his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the horizon. The city that had once swallowed him whole now moved to his rhythm, even if it didn't know it yet. The blood had dried, the guns were silent, and the Mafia had been reborn. But in the shadows, the next move was already being planned, and Carlo Gambino was already 2 steps ahead. Chapter 4. The Luciano Era and Gambino's Rise. The year was 1931, and New York smelled like smoke and wet asphalt. The Great Depression had hollowed out the city, but in the shadows, another kind of empire was being built, an empire of silence, profit, and control. The old guard was gone, buried with their arrogance. The Castellammarese War had cleaned the slate. And in the uneasy calm that followed, a new generation of men began to shape what the Mafia would become. At the center of it all was Lucky Luciano, the visionary who replaced fear with structure, and standing quietly beside him was Carlo Gambino, the man who understood that true power didn't shout, it whispered. Luciano's new order was revolutionary. He created the Commission, a council where bosses from across the country could settle disputes without bloodshed. 5 families in New York: Luciano, Mangano, Gagliano, Bonanno, and Prophesy, each ruled their own territory, all answering to no single boss. It was democracy by design, dictatorship by discipline. The rules were clear. No one man could ever again claim to be capo di tutti capi. The Mafia would never fall into another suicidal war. At least, that was the dream. Carlo Gambino didn't rush to climb the ladder. He watched, waited, and listened. The Mangano family, led by brothers Vincent and Philip, controlled the Brooklyn docks and had deep ties to the International Longshoremen's Association. That's where Carlo made his quiet entrance. The docks were the veins of the city, and whoever controlled them could strangle the flow of goods, money, or men. It was dirty work disguised as legitimate business, and Carlo thrived in that gray area. He began under Vincent Mangano as a soldier, a quiet face in a noisy world. He dressed simply, spoke little, and worked relentlessly. The Manganos liked him because he didn't act like a gangster. He wasn't flashy, didn't gamble, didn't drink excessively, and avoided women who came with gossip attached. In an underworld full of men desperate for attention, Carlo's invisibility made him invaluable. He built alliances slowly, through favors and silence. When disputes arose over Union territories, he mediated with calm precision. When money went missing, he found it without accusations. When violence was necessary, it was done efficiently, quietly, and never traced back to him. Over time, his reputation grew among the ranks, not as a killer, but as a thinker. Men began to say, "If you want chaos, call Anastasia. If you want results, call Gambino." Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, was the opposite of everything Carlo represented. Loud, impulsive, terrifying. A man whose name alone could make men sweat. Anastasia ran Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm of the Mafia, a group of contract killers who handled business across the country. To most, Anastasia was untouchable, unpredictable, and necessary. But to Carlo, he was dangerous in another way. Too visible, too emotional. The kind of man whose rise always ends in his own blood. Still, Anastasia saw something useful in Gambino. He respected his composure and loyalty, often relying on him to manage delicate situations. Together, they became a strange partnership, fire and ice, storm and silence. While Anastasia handled executions, Gambino handled operations. It was a perfect balance, but one built on a fault line that would one day crack wide open. Luciano, meanwhile, continued to expand his influence beyond New York. He forged alliances with Jewish mobsters like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, blending old-world mafia codes with modern business. The Mafia was no longer just a gang. It was a corporation. Bootlegging turned into real estate. Gambling turned into entertainment. Even Hollywood began to feel the pull of invisible strings. And through it all, Gambino was learning. He saw that the real genius of Luciano wasn't in violence. It was in order. Luciano didn't need to control everything. He just needed to make sure everyone thought they needed him. Carlo understood that completely. He adopted the same philosophy for himself. Let others take the spotlight while you collect the profits from the shadows. But power always attracts enemies. In 1936, the U.S. government finally came after Lucky Luciano. New York's crusading district attorney, Thomas Dewey, charged him with running a nationwide prostitution ring. The evidence was thin, but the witnesses were terrified enough to talk. Luciano was convicted and sentenced to 50 years in prison. The empire he built didn't collapse. It adapted. But for the men beneath him, it was a warning. The government had discovered that the Mafia wasn't a myth. It was real, organized, and vulnerable. Luciano appointed his loyal lieutenant, Vito Genovese, as acting boss, but Genovese fled to Italy to escape a murder charge. Frank Costello stepped in to keep the peace, running the organization with diplomacy rather than force. The Mafia entered its most discreet era. No more flashy killings, no more public wars. Just steady, silent profit. Carlo Gambino flourished under this kind of leadership. The Mangano family, however, was less stable. Vincent Mangano distrusted Anastasia's growing influence. He accused him of overstepping boundaries, of making decisions without approval. The tension simmered for years. Gambino watched it all like a chess player watching two opponents exhaust themselves. He said nothing, did nothing, just waited. Then, in 1951, Vincent Mangano vanished. His body was never found. His brother Philip turned up dead shortly after. Everyone knew who was responsible, but no one said it aloud. Anastasia took over the family, and the commission, unwilling to ignite another war, accepted it. The Mangano family was now the Anastasia family, and Gambino was its new underboss. It was a quiet promotion, almost ceremonial, but it marked a turning point in his life. He had gone from dock worker to second-in-command of one of New York's most powerful mafia families, all without drawing a single headline. Anastasia trusted him completely. "You're my brain," he once said, clapping Carlo on the shoulder. "I don't think without you." Gambino smiled politely, but inside, he already knew how the story of Albert Anastasia would end. The 1950s were a golden era for the American Mafia. With Prohibition long gone, they expanded into unions, construction, gambling, narcotics, and even legitimate businesses. The Mafia's influence reached Washington, Las Vegas, Cuba, and beyond. Politicians were paid, judges were compromised, and the FBI still pretended organized crime didn't exist. To the public, the Mafia was an urban legend. To Carlo Gambino, it was an empire quietly humming beneath America's surface. He became a master of invisibility. No one could find photographs of him. He avoided reporters, avoided parties, avoided the kind of vanity that doomed so many. When he met people, he remembered their children's names, their debts, their fears. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. Men bent to his will because they believed he already knew the next 5 moves. But even as profits soared, cracks began to form inside the family. Anastasia's temper was uncontrollable. He'd kill over insults, paranoia, or even boredom. One night, he reportedly murdered a man in a hotel lobby because he thought the man had looked at him wrong. His reputation as a mad dog grew, and with it, his list of enemies. The other bosses began to whisper that he was bad for business. And in the Mafia, bad for business was a death sentence. Carlo heard the whispers. He didn't start them, but he didn't silence them either. He was careful, cautious, invisible, like a ghost orchestrating a storm. In quiet meetings, he strengthened ties with men who shared his vision. Vito Genovese, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello. Together, they began to plan what couldn't be spoken aloud. In 1957, Luciano, exiled to Italy after being released from prison for his wartime cooperation with the U.S., watched from afar as his American empire trembled. Costello survived an assassination attempt ordered by Genovese. The old order was collapsing again. And amid that chaos, Carlo Gambino made his move. Anastasia's execution was as legendary as it was inevitable. On October 25, 1957, he sat in a Manhattan barbershop at the Park Sheraton Hotel. 2 men entered wearing scarves over their faces. They fired several shots into him before he could stand. Anastasia fell forward, dead before his body hit the floor. The newspapers screamed, "Execution of the Lord High Executioner." But the real story wasn't in the blood. It was in the silence afterward. No one talked. No one confessed. No one even pretended to know. Behind closed doors, everyone already did. And just like that, Carlo Gambino became boss. He didn't celebrate. He didn't even change his routine. The day after the killing, He was seen walking near the docks, hands in his pockets, speaking softly to union men about shipment schedules. To the FBI, it was like watching a ghost step into daylight. They knew he'd orchestrated it, but they couldn't touch him. There were no witnesses, no trails, no evidence, only rumors, and those were swallowed by fear. When the commission met to approve the transition, the other bosses agreed unanimously. They all trusted Carlo's discipline, his calm, his intelligence. He wasn't a killer like Anastasia or a showman like Costello. He was something rarer, a builder. Under his rule, the family thrived. He expanded their reach into construction companies, trucking, and garment manufacturing. Every union, every shipment, every contract passed through his silent network. The Gambino family, formerly Mangano, then Anastasia, was reborn under his name. He ruled with an iron patience. Problems were solved quietly. Disputes were settled before they became wars. Where Anastasia had ruled by fear, Gambino ruled by calculation. If someone crossed him, they didn't find a gun at their door. They found themselves cut off, isolated, frozen out of business until they either came crawling back or vanished from relevance. The FBI began calling him the Godfather, though Carlo himself would have despised the word. He preferred to be underestimated, to be dismissed as another aging immigrant in Brooklyn. He wore cheap suits, drove modest cars, and held Sunday dinners like any neighborhood patriarch. But in the shadows, his reach was global. The Luciano era had birthed modern organized crime, and Carlo Gambino had quietly become its greatest student. He learned that power didn't need noise. It needed patience. He learned that leadership wasn't about commanding fear. It was about creating inevitability. When he gave an order, it wasn't a threat. It was a fact. As the 1950s faded into the 1960s, the Mafia entered its most stable and profitable age. Millions poured in from legitimate fronts, and the Gambino family sat at the top of it all. Yet, in that peace, Carlo remained cautious. He'd seen too many empires fall to ego. He trusted no one completely, not even blood. He often told his sons, "A man who talks too much digs his own grave." He never forgot Sicily, never forgot the lessons of the hills where silence meant life. And as he sat in his Staten Island home late at night, sipping coffee in the dim glow of a single lamp, he knew he had achieved something no one before him truly had. He had made the Mafia invisible again. But in the distance, faint as a heartbeat, trouble was stirring. Law enforcement was changing. The FBI, once blind to organized crime, was beginning to see patterns, names, connections. The commission's secrecy was no longer safe. The quiet life Carlo had mastered would soon face its greatest test. He put out his cigarette, stood from his chair, and looked out the window at the dark city beyond. He could feel the winds shifting, the way they always did before something big. The Luciano era had built the system, but now, men like him would have to protect it. And in that cold silence, he smiled faintly. He was ready, because Carlo Gambino had never needed noise to win. He had built his empire from whispers, and he knew, better than anyone, that even in a world of guns and blood, silence was still the sharpest weapon of all. Chapter 5. The Mangano Years. A Quiet Lieutenant. The docks of Brooklyn were a world of their own, a place where sweat mixed with salt, where men spoke with their hands, and where deals were sealed in the spaces between words. To most, they were just waterfronts. To Carlo Gambino, they were veins pumping life through the heart of an empire still in its infancy. The year was 1936. Luciano's new system had stabilized the Mafia after years of bloodshed, and the five families were settling into their territories. The Mangano brothers, Vincent and Philip, ruled over the waterfront with an iron grip hidden beneath polite smiles. They were traditionalists, men who believed the old Sicilian codes still had meaning. And beneath them, quietly, efficiently, patiently, worked a lieutenant named Carlo Gambino. He wasn't a boss yet, not even close. But in a world where men clawed their way upward with knives and bullets, Carlo had already begun building his foundation one quiet favor at a time. While others chased glory, he chased stability. He didn't make headlines, and that was the point. He was the calm in a storm that everyone else seemed addicted to. Every morning, he walked the piers with the same careful rhythm, hands behind his back, hat tilted low, watching everything. He noticed who showed up late, who pocketed extra cash, who whispered too loudly. The foreman nodded respectfully as he passed. They didn't need to be reminded who really ran the docks. If you wanted a job, you went through the union. If you wanted the union's blessing, you went through the Manganos. And if you wanted the Manganos to listen, you went through Gambino. The waterfront was the perfect cover for organized crime. Thousands of tons of cargo moved daily: coffee, sugar, silk, weapons, whiskey, even bodies sometimes. Every crate was an opportunity, every shipment a chance to skim. The police could never track it all. The Manganos took their cut, the unions took theirs, and somewhere in the middle, Carlo learned how to make money appear and disappear like smoke. He had a gift for diplomacy. When disputes broke out between longshoremen or rival crews, he handled them with the patience of a priest. Violence was always the last resort. Blood draws attention, he'd say quietly. Money keeps it away. And in the America of the late 30s, attention was dangerous. The government had begun sniffing around organized labor, sending investigators to the docks. But Carlo was ready. He kept his books clean enough to pass inspection, paid the right people just enough to stay blind, and made sure no one ever saw his name on anything. The Manganos appreciated his loyalty. Vincent, the elder brother, was a man of routines and rules. He dressed impeccably, spoke softly, and demanded order in his organization. He was no fool. He saw how the younger generation was shifting toward business and away from brute force. He liked that Gambino was both Sicilian to his bones and yet modern in his thinking. "You remind me of the old world," Vincent told him once during a quiet dinner. "But you understand this new one better than I ever will." Carlo didn't respond with flattery. He simply nodded, thanked him for the meal, and listened as Mangano spoke about honor, loyalty, and the burden of leadership. Later that night, as he walked home through the fog, Carlo thought about those words. Honor was a luxury. Loyalty was negotiable. The only burden worth carrying was survival. The younger brother, Philip, was different, more temperamental, more impulsive. He liked to make examples of men who crossed him. He thought fear was power. Carlo never corrected him, but inside, he understood the truth. Fear fades faster than trust. Men obey out of fear, but they serve out of respect. And Carlo knew how to build respect one quiet success at a time. His influence spread slowly through the 1930s. He managed shipments for the family, organized gambling dens in the back rooms of waterfront bars, and kept the books for several trucking companies that were more front than business. He didn't waste time on petty rackets. He was building infrastructure. When other lieutenants bragged about the number of men they'd killed, Carlo talked about payrolls, routes, and logistics. They laughed at his caution. Later, they'd learn that caution was another word for control. Outside the Mafia, America was changing fast. Prohibition was gone, but corruption was alive and well. Politicians wanted votes. Unions wanted protection. Corporations wanted muscle. And behind it all, the Mafia offered solutions. A strike that needed adjusting, a shipment that needed rerouting, a man who needed reminding. It was all business. Carlo became the quiet architect of those arrangements. The city's power brokers didn't even realize how much they depended on him. By the time the Second World War erupted, Gambino's reach stretched far beyond the docks. With America mobilizing for war, the shipping industry exploded with government contracts. Carlo saw opportunity in the chaos. The Mafia supplied the labor, ensured security, and made sure nothing slowed down. In return, they controlled who worked and who didn't. Every crate unloaded on the East River had a price, and a small piece of it always found its way back to Carlo. War also brought unexpected allies. When German submarines began attacking ships off the Atlantic coast, the U.S. Navy quietly turned to the Mafia for help securing the docks from sabotage. Lucky Luciano, still imprisoned, offered assistance in exchange for leniency. The operation worked. The Mafia became unofficially useful to the government, and men like Gambino gained untouchable status. It was ironic. While fighting fascism abroad, America relied on its own brand of quiet tyranny at home. During those war years, Carlo kept a low profile, as always. While many of his peers grew bold from easy money, he grew cautious. He'd seen enough to know that every boom ended with a bullet or a prison cell. So he saved, invested, and diversified. He bought small businesses through intermediaries, laundries, repair shops, construction firms. He laundered money through them, slowly turning blood profits into legitimate wealth. He married Catherine Castellano, linking himself to another respected Mafia family. It wasn't just love, it was strategy. The Castellanos were loyal, disciplined, and respected. Through marriage, Gambino tied himself to a bloodline that would later become the backbone of his empire. Their home life was quiet, almost normal. He ate dinner with his children, went to church on Sundays, and greeted neighbors politely. If you saw him on the street, you wouldn't think crime boss. You'd think bank clerk. That was the secret. Disguise your power behind ordinariness. But not everyone around him lived that way. Albert Anastasia's star was rising fast. A fierce, unpredictable killer, Anastasia had made his reputation as one of the architects of Murder Incorporated. His name struck fear across the country. He and Gambino were opposites. Anastasia thrived on chaos, while Gambino thrived on order. Yet, they formed a strange, symbiotic bond. Anastasia respected Gambino's intelligence. Gambino respected Anastasia's effectiveness. They needed each other, for now. Vincent Mangano, however, didn't trust Anastasia. He saw his ambition, his temper, and the way men whispered his name with equal parts awe and dread. The tension grew between them like cracks in old pavement. The brothers wanted to keep the family old school, hierarchical, ceremonial, predictable. Anastasia wanted modernization through force. And caught between them was Gambino, quietly observing both sides, learning from their mistakes. By the late 1940s, the Mafia's power was reaching its peak. Luciano's vision had taken root. The commission kept peace among the families. Profits from gambling, construction, and shipping were staggering. Yet peace always has an expiration date. The Mangano's old-world pride collided with the ruthless ambition of the new generation. The brothers began to suspect that Anastasia was plotting against them, using Gambino as his bridge to higher circles. They weren't entirely wrong. Gambino met frequently with Anastasia in dimly lit restaurants or parked cars along quiet Brooklyn streets. They talked about business, about the future, about the weaknesses of the current leadership. Gambino never explicitly betrayed the Manganos, but he didn't protect them either. He knew the inevitable end of this story. Power consumed itself, and when it did, the survivors were the ones who kept their hands clean. In 1951, the storm broke. Vincent Mangano vanished without a trace. His brother Philip's body was found in a marsh near Sheepshead Bay, riddled with bullets. The news rippled through the underworld like an earthquake. Everyone knew who was responsible. Anastasia, but no one dared say it. The Manganos were gone, their empire absorbed by the man they had mistrusted most. The commission held an emergency meeting. There was outrage, but there was also fear. Killing a boss without approval was supposed to be forbidden. Yet Anastasia was too powerful, too connected to Luciano's old allies, and too feared to challenge directly. When the dust settled, Albert Anastasia became the new boss of what had been the Mangano family. And his first act as leader was to promote Carlo Gambino to underboss. It was a quiet coronation. No ceremony, no headlines, just a few words exchanged in a smoky room. "You're my right hand now," Anastasia told him, his voice low but filled with menace. "You keep the books clean. You keep the men in line. And if I die, you make sure my name doesn't die with me." Gambino nodded. He understood what wasn't being said. "Watch my back, and I'll watch yours." But inside, he knew this was temporary. The world saw Anastasia as unstoppable, but Gambino saw the cracks forming. The violence, the arrogance, the lack of control. It was all too familiar. He'd seen men like Anastasia before, and they always burned bright before collapsing in flames. For now, Gambino would remain loyal, because loyalty kept you alive. But he was already thinking about what came after. As underboss, Carlo's power grew exponentially. He controlled the money, the labor rackets, and the flow of information. He managed everything Anastasia didn't understand or didn't care to. The family prospered, but in quiet corners, men began to whisper another name. The Quiet One. The man who kept things running while the Mad Hatter made messes. Some even said the wrong man was wearing the crown. Gambino ignored them, but he heard it all. He didn't crave attention. He craved inevitability. And in that sense, fate was already working in his favor. The seeds of his eventual rise were planted right there, in the blood-soaked soil of the Mangano years. By the mid-1950s, as the docks bustled and the commission maintained its fragile balance, Carlo Gambino had quietly become indispensable. To the unions, he was a negotiator. To the police, a mystery. To the Mafia, a pillar of reason. And to himself, he was simply a man waiting for time to finish its work. Every night, he'd return home, remove his hat, kiss his wife, and sit in silence as the city hummed beyond the window. The world thought of power as something loud, a roar, a gunshot, a declaration. But he knew better. Power wasn't noise. Power was the pause between words, the silence before the storm. And though he said nothing, everyone who looked into his eyes could feel it. Carlo Gambino was next. Chapter 6. Anastasia's Reign of Terror. The morning Albert Anastasia officially took control of the family, the air in Brooklyn seemed to shift. It wasn't celebration, it was tension, the kind that made men lower their voices even in empty rooms. Anastasia had killed his way to the top, and everyone knew it. He was a storm given flesh, unpredictable, relentless, and hungry for more. The newspapers didn't know his name, but every man in the underworld did. And in the middle of that storm, standing silently beside him like a shadow that didn't move unless spoken to, was Carlo Gambino, the new underboss, the man who knew how this story would end before it even began. Anastasia was everything Gambino was not: loud, impulsive, volatile. He ruled through fear, not respect. His voice could fill a room, his temper could empty it. The soldiers called him the Mad Hatter, and not behind his back either. He wore the nickname like a medal. To him, the Mafia wasn't a business, it was a battlefield. Every slight was a declaration of war, every rumor a reason to kill. Men disappeared for looking at him wrong, for hesitating when answering a question, for being in the wrong bar at the wrong time. It was chaos wrapped in a tailored suit. And yet, for all his brutality, Anastasia was still a product of the old world. A man who believed loyalty could be carved with bullets. Gambino understood this and used it. He never challenged Anastasia, never corrected him, never told him no. He just listened, nodded, and quietly fixed the messes that followed in his wake. To everyone else, Gambino was the calm after the storm. But he knew better. He wasn't the calm after, it was the calm before. The 1950s were the high tide of organized crime in America. The economy was booming, construction was everywhere, and corruption bled into every corner of the city. The docks still fed millions of dollars into the family's pockets, but now there were new opportunities: real estate, restaurants, casinos, trucking, even garbage collection. Anastasia wanted all of it, and he wanted it fast. He barked orders, made threats, demanded tribute. The unions trembled at his name, and while he raged, Gambino quietly organized. Carlo began weaving the family's operations into something cleaner, more efficient, less visible. He replaced old soldiers with men he trusted, loyalists who understood that discretion was stronger than violence. He made deals that Anastasia never even heard about, deals that made both of them richer but kept the blood off their hands. He was building a machine that could run without noise. But Anastasia's thirst for control didn't stop at business. He meddled in everything: the commission, the territories, even politics. He believed he could rule through fear alone, that no one would dare defy him. For a while, he was right. But fear, Gambino knew, was unstable. It made men loyal only as long as they were more afraid of you than of anyone else. And fear always fades when a stronger enemy appears. One night in 1953, a dispute broke out over a union election. A young longshoreman named Anthony Coletti had spoken out against the Mafia's control of the docks. He was found dead the next morning, shot twice in the head, his body dumped in the East River. The newspapers called it a labor dispute. Everyone else called it a message. Anastasia smiled when he read it, proud of the chaos. Gambino didn't smile. He saw what it meant. Attention. The kind that brought headlines, politicians, and FBI agents sniffing around. It was the one thing he couldn't tolerate. Anastasia didn't care. He loved his reputation as the executioner. He loved that men crossed the street when he walked by. He loved that he could sit in a restaurant and the room went silent. That kind of power intoxicated him, and it clouded his judgment. When he felt insulted, he acted before thinking. He once ordered the death of a tailor because the man had overcharged him for a suit. To him, it wasn't madness. It was pride. But pride, Gambino knew, was a curse that always killed its host. The FBI was changing. J. Edgar Hoover, once dismissive of organized crime, had begun to understand its scope. Wiretaps, informants, and undercover agents started creeping into the Mafia's world. For the first time, the organization wasn't invisible. The more bodies Anastasia left behind, the clearer the trail became. The bosses began to murmur that he was drawing too much light to all of them. The Mafia's golden rule was simple: profit without publicity. Anastasia was breaking it every day. At the same time, Vito Genovese was plotting his own power grab. Genovese had always been the most ambitious of the bosses, a snake that never stopped shedding its skin. He wanted total control of the commission, and he knew Anastasia stood in his way. But killing a boss wasn't simple. It required approval, or, in this case, silence, from men who mattered. Men like Carlo Gambino. Gambino didn't rush into the conspiracy. He weighed every consequence, every angle. Anastasia trusted him completely. They'd share dinners, money, even secrets. But in the world they lived in, friendship was a luxury. Power was necessity. And Carlo had already seen how this story ended 100 times. He didn't need to guess. He could feel it coming, the same way sailors sense a storm long before the clouds appear. The final straw came with the murder of Arnold Schuster, a young civilian who had helped police capture a fugitive bank robber. Schuster wasn't part of the Mafia, but Anastasia ordered his death anyway, enraged that someone had dared act like a hero. The murder of an innocent man drew national outrage. It was reckless, senseless, and dangerous. The commission was furious. Even the old bosses whispered that Anastasia had lost control of himself. Gambino said nothing publicly, but behind closed doors, the wheels began to turn. He met quietly with Genovese, and later with Meyer Lansky, who acted as a neutral broker between families. The plan was dangerous but simple. Remove Anastasia, take his place, and stabilize the Mafia before it imploded under his madness. Carlo agreed on one condition: there would be no noise, no war, just a clean cut. In the weeks that followed, Carlo moved like a ghost. He avoided any suspicious meetings, spoke only in coded messages, and maintained his calm routine. To everyone else, he was still the loyal underboss, still walking the docks and shaking hands with union men. Even Anastasia, paranoid as he was, never suspected him. That was Carlo's greatest weapon. He looked like the one man in the room who would never betray you. On October 25, 1957, the world of Albert Anastasia came to a brutal end. He entered the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan for his usual morning shave. The barber draped a towel over his chest and turned away to prepare the razor. Two men walked in, scarves covering their faces. Without a word, they opened fire. Anastasia leapt from the chair, spinning toward the mirror, thinking the reflections were his attackers. The bullets tore through him, sending his body crashing to the floor in a pool of blood. The newspapers called it the barbershop murder. To the underworld, It was the quietest revolution in Mafia history. No wars followed, no retaliation, no arrests. The commission simply accepted the new reality. Albert Anastasia was gone, and Carlo Gambino was now boss. He didn't celebrate. He didn't hold meetings or parties. He didn't even announce his ascension. The following morning, he showed up to his usual cafe, ordered coffee, and read the paper as if nothing had happened. When the other men entered, one by one, they greeted him not as underboss, but as the new leader. It was silent, unspoken, inevitable. Under Carlo, everything changed. The family that had been known for bloodshed became known for discipline. Violence didn't disappear, it just went underground. Gambino ran his empire like a businessman, not a general. He focused on unions, construction, shipping, and labor rackets. He diversified investments, spread risk, and kept the family invisible to outsiders. For the first time in decades, the Mafia wasn't making headlines. It was making money, but the ghost of Anastasia's reign lingered. Some men were loyal to the old boss and resented Gambino's restraint. They wanted the chaos back, the wild profits of intimidation and murder. Carlo dealt with them the same way he dealt with everything, patiently. Some he bought off, some he promoted into harmless roles, and a few, the ones who couldn't be controlled, simply disappeared, quietly, without witnesses, without explanation. The FBI called him the Invisible Don. They couldn't find evidence of his crimes, couldn't record his voice on tape, couldn't even photograph him clearly. He moved through the city like smoke. The other bosses, Genovese, Bonanno, Lucchese, respected him, even feared him, but none could ever pin down how he managed to stay untouchable. Carlo once told an associate, "You can't arrest a shadow." That was the essence of his power. He wasn't a ghost because he vanished. He was a ghost because he never appeared in the first place. Still, there were nights when even Carlo Gambino couldn't escape the weight of what he'd done. When he walked alone through his Staten Island property, the wind carrying the scent of the ocean, he would think of the men who had come before, Luciano, Maranzano, Anastasia, and how each had believed they'd found a way to outsmart fate. In the end, they all died the same way. The only difference was how long they lasted before the bullet found them. Carlo intended to be the exception. He built a regime of secrecy and order. Meetings were rare and brief. Messages were passed through trusted lieutenants. He cut ties with unnecessary associates, trimmed the fat from his organization until only the essential remained. To outsiders, he seemed cold, even paranoid. To those who understood, it was survival. He had watched too many men die because they believed their power made them immortal. But in quiet moments, he could feel the old world closing in. The rules were changing again. The FBI was getting smarter. The Mafia's golden age of invisibility was ending. Television, telephones, surveillance, all the tools of the modern world were turning against them. Gambino saw it coming, but he also knew something the law didn't. No matter how much technology evolved, human nature didn't. Greed, fear, loyalty, betrayal, they were constants. And as long as those existed, there would always be men like him. The rest of the bosses couldn't see that far ahead. They still played the old games of ego and territory. Genovese, now drunk on power, tried to expand his reach, believing he could dominate the commission. But Carlo was already 3 moves ahead. He formed quiet alliances with the Lucchese family, strengthening his influence while Genovese made enemies. When Genovese was eventually taken down in a narcotics sting in 1959, many said it was coincidence. Carlo knew better. Nothing in his world was coincidence. By the end of the decade, the family was no longer the Anastasia family. It was the Gambino family, an empire that stretched across unions, shipping companies, trucking firms, and even Hollywood interests. It was the largest, most profitable criminal organization in America, built on silence, patience, and the lessons of every man who died before him. But deep down, Gambino never forgot that all of it, the wealth, the respect, the quiet control, had been born from one brutal morning in a barber shop. The memory haunted him not as guilt, but as a reminder, power always comes with a price. The trick was never to stop paying it. Sometimes, late at night, he would replay the story in his mind, the gunman entering, the shots, the blood spreading across white tiles. He'd imagine Anastasia's confusion, the flash of betrayal in his eyes. It wasn't pride that filled him. It was something colder, understanding. He had done what needed to be done, and one day, someone else would do the same to him. That was the way of things. He crushed out his cigarette, poured himself a small glass of wine, and stared at the city lights beyond his window. He had survived every war, outlasted every rival, and turned chaos into order. For now, the world was quiet, but even silence has a heartbeat, and Carlo Gambino could feel it pulsing beneath the surface of his empire, faint and steady, the promise that peace never lasts forever. Chapter 7. The Rise of the Quiet Dawn. The morning after Albert Anastasia's murder, New York woke up uneasy. The newspapers called it gangland chaos. The police called it a mysterious execution. But the underworld knew better. It was the dawn of a new era. In the smoky cafes and shadowed backrooms, men spoke the same name in hushed tones: Carlo Gambino. Some said he planned the killing. Some said he'd only allowed it to happen. But everyone agreed on one thing. He was the man now. The man no one had seen coming. The man who would rule not through blood, but through silence. The streets didn't explode with violence the way they had after other bosses fell. There were no revenge shootings, no open wars. The killing of Anastasia had been surgical, clean, decisive, final. Within days, the family that once bore his name had a new leader. There was no vote, no argument, no ceremony. The transition was seamless, as if the universe itself had quietly shifted in Gambino's favor. He didn't have to announce his rule. Power like his didn't need to be declared. It was simply understood. When he walked into the Rave Night Social Club that week, every man in the room stood. He nodded once, said nothing, and took his usual seat. That was the coronation. No speeches, no applause, just acknowledgement. It was the beginning of the reign of the Quiet Dawn. Carlo Gambino understood something most men in his world never did, that the Mafia was less a kingdom and more a machine. If you kept it running smoothly, no one cared who pulled the levers. His first act as boss was to eliminate noise. He forbade unnecessary killings, ordered all disputes to be settled quietly, and demanded discipline from his men. "We make money, not headlines," he told them, his voice low and even. "The ones who make headlines don't last." It was a lesson he had learned watching others die for attention. Now he was determined to make invisibility his greatest weapon. The family he inherited was fractured. Anastasia's brutality had created fear, but not loyalty. The soldiers were tense, uncertain, waiting to see what kind of leader this quiet man would be. Gambino didn't rush to assert dominance. He visited crews one by one, sat with capos in small cafes, and listened more than he spoke. He asked questions about business, about family, about their needs. It wasn't a performance. It was calculation. He wanted to know everything. Every weak point, every ambition, every man's price. By the time those meetings were done, the uncertainty was gone. They didn't just respect him. They trusted him. He made it clear that his rule would be different. There would be order, patience, and profit. If someone had a problem, it would be solved through quiet mediation, not bloodshed. If someone broke the rules, they wouldn't be shot in the street. They'd be erased financially, socially, spiritually. He replaced fear with something stronger: inevitability. To cross Carlo Gambino wasn't to invite punishment. It was to invite disappearance. Under his leadership, the family flourished. He tightened control of the docks and trucking unions, expanded into construction and garment districts, and created networks so complex the government could barely trace them. He didn't gamble on flash ventures or risky schemes. He invested in stability. Every dollar was cleaned through legitimate businesses, trucking companies, shipping firms, real estate developments. He made the criminal economy indistinguishable from the legitimate one. To the outside world, it looked like prosperity. To those who knew the truth, it was empire. But Gambino wasn't content with just money. He wanted structure. He wanted the Mafia to evolve beyond the crude violence that had exposed so many before him. He strengthened the Commission's authority, repaired relationships with other families, and brought a sense of quiet professionalism to the criminal underworld. Even his rivals admitted that under Gambino, the Mafia was running smoother than it ever had. He had a gift for diplomacy. When disputes erupted between bosses, he calmed them with soft words and harder logic. He didn't posture or threaten. He reasoned. Violence, he'd say, is like fire. It warms your hands today and burns your house down tomorrow. Men who had built their reputations on blood found themselves yielding to his calm authority. He didn't need to shout. He simply made sense. It was during these years that Carlo's legend began to take shape. The FBI started calling him the Godfather, though he hated the word. He preferred to think of himself as a businessman, not a criminal monarch. But the name stuck. They said he ruled the Mafia like a corporate chairman, calculating risk, delegating power, removing inefficiency. And they weren't wrong. He was turning the Mafia from a gang into a boardroom. He rarely appeared in public, but when he did, he looked like any other middle-aged immigrant. Neatly dressed, soft-spoken, polite. He didn't carry himself like a man who controlled millions. He carried himself like a man who knew he didn't have to prove it. He drove modest cars, lived quietly in Staten Island, and spent his evenings with family. Yet in that quiet life, decisions were made that rippled across the country. Politicians were funded, unions were steered, judges were bought, and businesses were taken apart or rebuilt at his will. Behind the calm, though, there was calculation sharper than any knife. Gambino's mind was a network of contingencies. Every alliance had an expiration date. Every favor had a price. He was always 3 steps ahead, preparing for threats that hadn't yet appeared. And he understood that the greatest threats often came from within. One of his most important alliances was with Tommy Lucchese, boss of the Lucchese family. The two men were kindred spirits, both pragmatic, both measured, both allergic to chaos. Together, they formed an invisible partnership that would dominate New York's labor rackets for decades. Lucchese handled transportation and garment unions. Gambino handled the docks and construction. Between them, they controlled the movement of nearly every product that entered or left the city. It wasn't violence that made them powerful. It was control of logistics. They didn't just rule the streets. They ruled the economy. Gambino's influence grew beyond the 5 families. Chicago, Philadelphia, Miami, bosses from across the country sought his counsel. They trusted his judgment, his neutrality, his restraint. He became a mediator in disputes that could have torn the Mafia apart. To some, he was a savior. To others, a manipulator. To Carlo, it was just business. But power always attracts envy. Not everyone appreciated his soft-spoken rule. Some older bosses saw his weakness. They missed the old days of open intimidation, of public executions and bloody warnings. They whispered that Gambino had made the Mafia too quiet, too civilized. He didn't argue. He just smiled and let time prove him right. Because while they fought for scraps of reputation, he was building permanence. The FBI watched closely. They had dossiers filled with names, photos, maps, but no evidence. Gambino's genius was his invisibility. He never used phones, never signed documents, never spoke carelessly. Every instruction went through layers of intermediaries. If the Bureau got close to one link, 2 others vanished. He's like smoke, one agent said. Every time we think we've got him, he's already moved on. Still, Carlo wasn't naive. He knew that government pressure was growing. In 1957, the Appalachian meeting had exposed the Mafia's national network to the public for the first time. Dozens of bosses were arrested in a single raid. Gambino, by luck or foresight, hadn't attended. He watched from afar as the news exploded, realizing that the age of true secrecy was ending. Law enforcement now knew what they were dealing with. The FBI began wiretapping, tracking movements, building cases. For men who had spent decades pretending the Mafia didn't exist, it was a rude awakening. For Gambino, it was an opportunity. He used the chaos to his advantage. While others panicked, he tightened his structure further, eliminating loose ends and modernizing operations. He diversified income streams, investing heavily in legitimate industries that provided cover for criminal activity. Construction companies, taxi services, garment factories. Everything fed into the same quiet machine. Money flowed up, clean and steady. The family grew richer, but the man at the top remained unseen. He was always cautious with succession. He trusted only blood. His son, Thomas, became a rising figure in the family, and his nephew, Paul Castellano, handled major operations. Carlo believed that family was both shield and sword. It created loyalty that money alone could not buy, but also came with risk. Nepotism could breed resentment, so he balanced it carefully, promoting outsiders as well, keeping everyone dependent but never equal. No one knew exactly how much power they held, and that uncertainty kept them loyal. By the mid-1960s, the Gambino family was the largest and most powerful mafia organization in America. Its influence extended into legitimate unions, major corporations, and city contracts worth millions. Construction projects couldn't move a brick without their approval. Shipping companies couldn't operate without paying tribute. Even Hollywood had ties that traced back to Carlo's network. Yet through it all, he maintained his facade of normalcy. He attended church, went on walks, and spoke softly with neighbors. If you pass him on the street, you'd never guess that he ruled an empire built on invisible violence. But beneath the surface, threats were brewing. The Genovese family, long rivals of the Gambinos, were quietly reorganizing. Federal prosecutors were becoming more aggressive. The FBI had launched Operation Underworld, aiming to infiltrate labor unions and expose mafia control. Informants, once unthinkable, were beginning to appear. The old code of omerta, the sacred silence, was starting to crack. Gambino saw it happening in slow motion, the way a hunter sees a trap being laid. But he didn't panic. He adapted. He began pushing the family deeper into legitimate businesses, away from street-level crime. Drugs, which brought fast money but deadly attention, were banned. He told his men, "Drugs make you rich today and bury you tomorrow." Instead, he focused on racketeering, gambling, and financial schemes hidden behind layers of legality. It was the evolution of organized crime, from brute force to bureaucracy, and no one did it better than Carlo Gambino. He aged gracefully into power, never losing his composure, never letting his paranoia show. But those closest to him could see the toll it took. His health began to falter in the early 1970s. Heart trouble, exhaustion, insomnia. Still, he refused to slow down. Every day, he reviewed reports, discussed union contracts, and oversaw the quiet orchestration of an empire that spanned from Brooklyn to Las Vegas. He wasn't just running a family anymore. He was running a system. By then, the younger generation of gangsters had begun calling him Don Carlo. They said it with reverence. He represented something they'd never seen before, a man who had reached the top without chaos, without spectacle, without downfall. He was proof that patience could outlive violence. Yet, even as they admired him, they misunderstood him. They thought his calm came from peace. It didn't. It came from understanding. He knew better than anyone that the peace he'd built would not last forever. Late one evening, sitting in his Staten Island home, he told a trusted friend, "In this life, you only borrow power. You never own it." The man nodded, unsure what to say. Gambino smiled faintly. "The trick," he said, "is to make sure no one knows when the time comes to give it back." That was the essence of his philosophy. Power wasn't about holding on. It was about letting go so smoothly no one realized you'd done it. He would go on to rule for nearly 2 decades, longer than any modern mafia boss before him. His empire would reach heights the old Sicilian dons could only dream of. But in that rise lay the seeds of everything that would one day fall. For in the quiet order Carlo Gambino built, ambition still slept, waiting for the next man too impatient to wait his turn. And though he didn't know it yet, the clock was already ticking toward that moment. For now, though, The quiet dawn reigned unchallenged, his word law, his silence thunder, his shadow stretching across every corner of the American underworld. The storm had passed, the blood had dried, and the empire was calm. But somewhere in that calm, deep and unspoken, was the whisper of fate reminding him, silence never lasts forever. Chapter 8. The Appalachian Summit and the Fallout, 1957. The morning of November 14th, 1957, the quiet town of Appalachian, New York, looked like something out of a postcard. Rolling hills, fading autumn leaves, the smell of cold earth, and with smoke hanging in the air. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and waved to strangers. No one could have guessed that behind the gate of a wealthy distributor's house on McFall Road, history's most infamous underworld gathering was about to take place. Men who ruled cities from coast to coast, who commanded armies of killers and empires of crime, were arriving in Buicks and Cadillacs, dressed in their finest suits and fedoras. Among them was Carlo Gambino, the quiet new boss of what had once been the Anastasia family. And though he didn't speak much, his presence spoke volumes. This was not just a meeting. It was a coronation. The meeting was called by Vito Genovese, who had grown too comfortable in the spotlight. After Luciano's exile and Costello's near assassination, Genovese had seized control of the Luciano family and now sought to make himself the undisputed head of all bosses. He wanted formal recognition, legitimacy within the underworld, and he needed the approval of the commission to get it. Appalachian was his stage. Bosses came from New York, Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, even Sicily. It was supposed to be a show of unity, a summit to plan business, peace, and expansion. But beneath the suits and smiles, it was about power, about who truly ruled the Mafia's new world. Carlo Gambino arrived quietly, as always. No entourage, no fanfare, just one driver and the calm expression of a man who already knew how the story would end. He didn't trust Genovese, and he never liked men who wanted to be kings. Kings died fast. Carlo preferred empires that ruled themselves. Still, he attended because absence spoke louder than words. If he didn't show, it would look like rebellion. If he did, it would look like compliance. So he did what he always did best. He stood in the middle and waited for everyone else to make mistakes. Inside Joseph Barber's house, the atmosphere was heavy with smoke and tension. Tables were lined with food, cold cuts, roasted meats, wine, pastries, but no one was really there to eat. They were there to posture. Genovese strutted like a man already wearing the crown. Around him were men like Joe Bonanno, Joe Prophesy, Stefano Megadino, and Tommy Lucchese. Each boss represented a city, a kingdom, a network of loyalty and fear. For a brief moment, the Mafia looked unified, almost corporate. But Gambino could feel in the air too many egos, too many secrets, too much ambition under one roof. It wasn't peace. It was pressure waiting to burst. The official agenda was business, how to handle narcotics, how to divide territories, how to expand into Cuba and Latin America. But what Genovese really wanted was acknowledgement. He wanted to be the face of the Mafia. He wanted men like Gambino to bow their heads when he spoke. And that was something Carlo would never do. When Genovese stood at the head of the table and began talking about unity under leadership, Gambino simply nodded politely, his hands folded in front of him, his face unreadable. He knew this wasn't leadership. It was suicide. The arrogance of the gathering was staggering. Dozens of luxury cars parked along a rural road, out-of-town license plates, men in expensive suits crowding into a quiet neighborhood. The locals noticed. A nearby resident saw the convoy of Cadillacs and called the police, suspecting some kind of corporate event, or worse, gangsters. State Trooper Edgar Croswell responded to the call. What he found would change the course of organized crime forever. Croswell drove up to the Barber estate and saw attendants trying to direct traffic, men loitering near the driveway, one of them visibly armed. He knew instantly this wasn't some business conference. He radioed for backup, and within minutes, state police cars began surrounding the property. Inside, someone shouted a warning. Panic erupted. The Mafia's most powerful men, bosses who could order killings with a phone call, were suddenly running through the woods in their $1,000 suits, stumbling over fences, diving into ditches, hiding behind trees. It was chaos, undignified and absurd. Carlo Gambino didn't run. He walked. He slipped out the back with quiet efficiency, adjusting his coat, blending with a group of fleeing guests. He didn't shout or panic. When the police began stopping cars on nearby roads, Carlo calmly got into a borrowed vehicle, told his driver to stay composed, and left the area without incident. No sirens, no arrest, no headlines with his name. Just another ghost disappearing into the fog. By nightfall, more than 60 mobsters were in custody. Names like Genovese, Megadino, Banano, and Lucchese filled the police reports. The newspapers the next day called it the Great Mafia Roundup. For the first time, America saw the Mafia not as rumor, but as organized reality. Photographs of well-dressed Italian men being marched into police stations were plastered across front pages nationwide. It was the first public proof of the thing they'd all denied existed. The word Mafia was no longer whispered, it was shouted. And everything changed. The fallout was immediate. Law enforcement finally had its confirmation, and Congress launched new hearings on organized crime. The FBI, humiliated by years of denial, formed dedicated units to investigate. The old days of invisibility were over. For the first time, the Underworld had a spotlight on it, and that light was blinding. Inside the Mafia, blame spread like infection. Men turned on each other, furious that such a foolish gathering had exposed them. Some accused Joseph Barbara of incompetence for hosting it. Others accused Genovese of arrogance for calling it. But beneath the noise, a quieter narrative began to emerge, one that pointed at Carlo Gambino. The whispers said he had known it would be raided, that he had deliberately let it happen, that by standing still while others ran, he had orchestrated a downfall without firing a single bullet. Whether it was true or not, it didn't matter. The result was the same. Genovese's reputation was ruined. His dream of becoming the supreme boss evaporated. The commission, once united, fractured under pressure. And in that chaos, Carlo Gambino rose higher than ever before. He didn't take credit. He didn't need to. When the commission convened weeks later to assess the damage, Carlo was the calmest man in the room. "We got sloppy," he said quietly. "No more meetings like that. No more attention." His voice carried weight that no shouting could match. The other bosses listened, chastened. From that moment on, the Mafia became smaller, quieter, more disciplined. Gambino had turned a disaster into an opportunity. Vito Genovese, humiliated and paranoid, began to suspect betrayal. He lashed out, ordering purges within his own family, cutting down anyone he thought had set him up. But Gambino stayed out of it, patient as ever. He didn't need revenge. Time would take care of it. And it did. Within 2 years, Genovese was indicted on narcotics charges, betrayed by his own lieutenants, and sentenced to prison. Many said the evidence had been conveniently planted. Few doubted who had arranged it. With Genovese gone, the path was clear. The commission named Carlo Gambino as its de facto leader. Officially, there was no boss of bosses. The title had been banned after Maranzano's death. But everyone knew who held the power now. When disputes arose between families, they went through him. When money needed moving, he approved it. When decisions about policy or leadership were made, his word was final. He didn't demand loyalty. He earned it. Under his guidance, the Mafia transformed. No more flashy violence. No more unnecessary killings. He brought back the old code: silence, subtlety, respect. The families functioned like legitimate corporations. The commission became less a council of warlords and more a board of directors. Gambino turned the Mafia into what it had always aspired to be: a shadow government, operating in plain sight. He made peace with the other bosses, even those who once opposed him. He reached out to Joe Bonanno, reassuring him that order would be restored. He strengthened his alliance with Tommy Lucchese, ensuring that the union stayed under their joint control. He even worked indirectly with Meyer Lansky to manage gambling operations in Cuba and the Caribbean. The message was clear: profit over pride. Violence was bad for business. But for all his success, the Appalachian fallout had left scars. The FBI had learned how to watch, how to listen. Wiretaps, informants, and undercover operations became constant threats. Gambino adapted by withdrawing further into the shadows. He limited face-to-face meetings, used only trusted intermediaries, and ensured that no decision could ever be traced back to him. He never wrote anything down, never used phones, never left fingerprints, literally or figuratively. The irony was rich. The very event that had nearly exposed the Mafia ended up proving his greatest strength: invisibility. The others were arrested, photographed, interrogated. Carlo Gambino walked away untouched, his reputation not just intact, but mythologized. To law enforcement, he became the phantom they couldn't catch. To his men, he became untouchable. Yet, for all the calm he projected, he never relaxed. The Appalachian disaster had shown him how fragile power could be. One mistake, one show of arrogance, and everything could crumble. He began operating with a paranoia that was both his weakness and his salvation. Every move was calculated, every word measured, every man watched. Trust was currency, and he spent it sparingly. In the years after Appalachian, Gambino's influence reached unprecedented heights. His family controlled the waterfront, construction, trucking, gambling, and a vast network of labor unions. Through these, he could slow entire industries or make them move faster. Politicians listened when he spoke, not because they feared him, but because they needed him. His fingerprints were on everything, even when no one could prove it. He had become what every mobster dreamed of and few ever achieved: a man too important to destroy. But even in that quiet dominance, there was an unease in him. He knew that visibility was poison, and the Mafia had been too visible for too long. He often told his closest men, "When they look for kings, make sure you look like the servant." It was advice born from survival, and he lived by it. Every now and then, he would glance at a newspaper headline about Appalachian and smile faintly. The world had changed that day. The Mafia was no longer invisible, but he was. That was the difference. While others had been unmasked, he had become the mask itself, a figure everyone knew existed but no one could ever touch. By the end of the 1950s, the balance of power had shifted completely. The old guard was gone, the reckless were in prison, and the survivors were men like Carlo Gambino, quiet, patient, deliberate. The Mafia had entered its age of order, an age he had built with silence as its foundation. Still, every empire carries the shadow of its creation. The Appalachian meeting had been a warning. Arrogance leads to downfall. And though Gambino had emerged unscathed, he knew fate never stops testing those who think they've outsmarted it. In the stillness of his Staten Island home, he sometimes imagined the scene. Cars lined along the hill, men running through the trees, panic in their eyes. He could almost hear the echo of it, a lesson that would follow him to his grave. He poured himself a glass of wine, stared out the window, and whispered to no one in particular, "Never call attention to yourself. The louder they are, the shorter they last." Then he took a slow sip, the faintest hint of satisfaction flickering across his face. He had survived what destroyed everyone else. Not by fighting, not by hiding, but by simply standing still when the world was on fire. The Appalachian Summit was supposed to make Vito Genovese the most powerful man in America. Instead, it crowned Carlo Gambino, the quiet don whose silence reshaped an entire empire. And as winter settled over New York that year, the underworld belonged to him, unseen yet everywhere, as if the wind itself whispered his name. Carlo Gambino ruled from the shadows, and for the first time, even the light was afraid to find him. Chapter 9. The Golden Age of the Gambino Family. The city never really slept, but under Carlo Gambino, it began to breathe differently. The noise of chaos that once filled New York's criminal underworld quieted to a steady rhythm, controlled, methodical, almost civilized. It was the late 1950s moving into the early 60s, and for the first time in its history, the American Mafia wasn't ruled by fear or blood, but by a calm, invisible hand. The newspapers had their own names for him: the Quiet Don, the Phantom, the Invisible Boss, but for the men who worked under him, he was simply Don Carlo. His voice didn't need to rise above a whisper. His silence carried farther than any gunshot. What he built in those years wasn't just a family. It was an empire disguised as stability. The Gambino family became a brand of control. From the docks of Brooklyn to the concrete towers of Manhattan, from the smoky gambling halls of the Bronx to the sunny streets of Miami, his reach spread silently. No one saw it happen. They just woke up one morning and realized that everything, every shipment, every contract, every handshake, ran through Carlo's network. He understood power like an artist understands balance. It couldn't be loud. It couldn't be reckless. It had to feel inevitable. Under his leadership, the Mafia stopped being an organization of killers and became something closer to a corporation. His men wore suits, carried briefcases, attended business lunches. The unions were their stock market, the city contracts their blue-chip investments. Money didn't flow through brown envelopes anymore. It moved through payrolls, construction bids, and pension funds. The criminal empire had gone legitimate, or at least looked like it. The docks were the beating heart of it all. Decades earlier, the Mafia had bled the waterfront dry with petty theft and smuggling. Gambino turned it into a fortress. He didn't just control the union. He became the union. Through men like Tony Ducks, Corallo, and Anthony Scotto, the Gambino family infiltrated every layer of the International Longshoremen's Association. They could decide which ships were unloaded first, which companies made profits, and which went bankrupt. Nothing entered or left New York Harbor without Gambino's silent approval. When businessmen complained about delays, they didn't realize they were negotiating with the most powerful crime boss in America. But while the docks kept money flowing, it was Gambino's mind for strategy that made the family untouchable. He diversified everything: construction, trucking, garbage collection, garment industries, even the food supply chain. He placed men in legitimate businesses that interfaced with unions, then made those businesses depend on his protection. It wasn't extortion, it was quiet partnership. And it worked because he always gave before he took. He solved problems for businessmen, made their operations smoother, kept strikes from happening, ensured shipments arrived on time. When they realized how easy life became under his protection, they never wanted to operate without him again. He didn't need to threaten anyone. He just made himself indispensable. At the same time, Gambino strengthened his political connections. He understood that power wasn't just built in the streets, it was bought in the offices of City Hall. He funded campaigns through intermediaries, arranged quiet donations, and secured favors that stretched all the way to Washington. Judges were promoted, cases disappeared, permits appeared overnight. Every level of government had someone who owed him something. He had no interest in being feared by politicians. He wanted to be useful to them. The other families noticed the difference. While the Genovese and Bonanno families tore themselves apart with ambition and betrayal, Gambino stayed steady. He avoided the drug trade, knowing it brought too much federal attention. He refused to let his men deal narcotics, even though the profits were enormous. "Drugs are poison," he once said during a closed-door meeting. "They make you rich for a day and dead for a lifetime." Some thought he was being overly cautious, but in the years that followed, those same men watched entire empires fall because of heroin and cocaine. Carlo outlived them all. He was a master at reading people. Every decision he made came from watching, listening, understanding. He'd sit in a room and say almost nothing, but when he finally spoke, his words would cut straight to the heart of the matter. Men who thought they could manipulate him often left meetings feeling like they'd just been outplayed without realizing it. One of his capos once said, "Carlo doesn't argue. He lets you talk yourself into his decision." He didn't believe in luck. He believed in structure. The family was divided into precise layers: boss, underboss, consigliere, capos, soldiers. Every man knew his place, and his responsibility. Disputes were handled internally. Money flowed upward smoothly, and no one outside the circle ever knew what was happening inside. The commission, the Mafia's council of bosses, met rarely, and when they did, Gambino's voice carried quiet authority. He never demanded control. He simply made sense, and the others followed. Even Joseph Bonanno, once a rival, respected him enough to seek his approval on decisions. But his genius wasn't just in organization. It was in the way he manipulated perception. To the public, he was invisible. To his neighbors in Staten Island, he was a quiet old man who loved his garden and his family. To his business associates, he was a modest investor. He paid his taxes, attended church, smiled politely at strangers. The FBI, desperate to catch him, called him the ghost with a heartbeat. They tailed him for years, recording conversations that led nowhere. Every phone call was about family dinners, church donations, or legitimate business. He never slipped. Not once. That invisibility became his greatest weapon. When the newspapers wrote about mafia wars, his name never appeared. When the FBI published lists of top criminals, they included him almost as an afterthought, always with the caveat that they had no solid evidence. The truth was, he didn't need to be seen to rule. His influence moved like wind, felt everywhere, visible nowhere. In his world, loyalty was currency. He rewarded it generously. Men who stayed true were promoted, protected, and given opportunities to build their own fortunes under his umbrella. Betrayal, though rare, was handled quietly. He never made examples out of people. He erased them. No spectacle, no message, just disappearance. That made the lesson more powerful. Fear of the unknown was always stronger than fear of the gun. He also understood family in the literal sense. His sons and nephews became his inner circle, particularly his nephew Paul Castellano, who showed a similar appetite for order and numbers. Carlo saw in him the qualities that could preserve what he had built, a businessman's brain inside a criminal's world. He began grooming Paul slowly, giving him more control over operations, letting him handle unions, contracts, and delicate negotiations. But he never said it out loud. In the Mafia, words about succession were as dangerous as bullets. Still, even as his empire thrived, the world outside began to change. Law enforcement was learning. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover had evolved from denial to obsession. They planted informants, wired meeting places, and began mapping the entire Mafia structure. Congressional hearings exposed the reach of organized crime, and federal task forces were formed to break it. Gambino watched it all with the same detached calm that had carried him through every storm. He knew they'd never catch him, not because he was untouchable, but because he refused to make the mistakes that others did. He never met in public, never discussed business over the phone, never left paper trails. His words vanished with the air that carried them. The 60s rolled into the 70s, and his wealth became generational. The family's control over unions gave him leverage in every industry that depended on labor. Trucking, construction, garment manufacturing. Each one was tied to contracts he could tighten or loosen at will. When a company wanted to avoid strikes, they came to him. When a rival family tried to muscle into his territories, they found doors closed and jobs drying up. Power wasn't about violence anymore. It was about who could quietly stop the world from moving. The Gambino family became synonymous with success. Even Hollywood began to notice. Movies about the Mafia drew inspiration from men like him, though they exaggerated the noise, the violence, the drama. Carlo laughed at them sometimes. If people really knew how boring power was, he once said with a half-smile, they wouldn't make so many movies about it. But there was nothing boring about the reach he had achieved. Through legitimate investments, the family had holdings in Las Vegas casinos, Florida real estate, and international shipping. His men were on payrolls of major companies, sitting in board meetings beside legitimate executives who never realized who they were working for. He had blurred the line between criminal and businessman so perfectly that sometimes even his closest allies couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. And yet, even in triumph, Carlo remained cautious. He had outlived every man who had once outranked him. Luciano died in exile. Genovese rotted in prison. Costello faded into quiet retirement. Bonanno's family fractured. Carlo Gambino, the quiet dockworker from Sicily, had become the last of the true dons, the final survivor of an age built on silence and patience. But he knew the clock was still ticking. The world was changing too fast. Technology made secrecy harder. Surveillance cameras appeared on street corners. The FBI's wiretaps became more advanced, their patience more relentless. Younger gangsters, raised in the age of television, craved attention. They wanted headlines, fast money, women, cars. They didn't understand that the noise that made them famous was the same noise that would destroy them. Gambino saw it all and knew that his time, the age of quiet power, was ending. He began preparing for the future with the same precision he'd built his empire. He arranged alliances that would protect his family after he was gone. He forged truces with the other bosses, ensuring no one would dare move against him or his bloodline. He taught his sons and nephews not to chase glory, not to fight wars that couldn't be won. The man who survives, he told them, is the man who knows when to disappear. By the early 70s, the Gambino family was the wealthiest Mafia family in America, with estimated annual earnings exceeding $500 million. But Carlo Gambino still lived modestly. His Staten Island home was comfortable but not extravagant. He wore simple suits, ate homemade meals, and attended church regularly. Neighbors described him as kind, quiet, polite. They had no idea that the old man trimming his hedges in the morning could order an entire city to stop moving by sunset. He had built what no other boss ever truly had, a dynasty that worked. No wars, no revolts, no internal chaos. Just quiet, disciplined order. But even as he enjoyed the calm, he knew the storm was never far. The FBI was patient, and history was unforgiving. Every man who had ever ruled this world eventually faced his reckoning. Carlo didn't fear it. He'd made peace with the inevitability of endings. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit by his window, listening to the sound of ships on the harbor. The water shimmered under the moonlight, steady, endless, indifferent. He thought about Sicily, about the dust roads of Cacamo, about how far silence had carried him. He wasn't a young man anymore. His heart grew weaker, his steps slower. But his mind was still as sharp as ever. He knew that one day, someone else would try to take what he built. They always do. But by then, it wouldn't matter. His name, his empire, his method, they would live on. Because Carlo Gambino had already done what no one else had managed to do. He had turned crime into legacy. And as the night wind drifted through the open window, carrying the faint sounds of the city he ruled without being seen, he smiled to himself, knowing the truth that every loud man had died never understanding. Real power makes no noise. It simply endures. Chapter 10. Business over blood, Gambino's philosophy. The older he grew, the quieter he became, and the quieter he became, the more powerful he was. Carlo Gambino had learned long ago that the loudest men were the ones closest to their downfall. By the time the 1960s settled into rhythm, his empire stretched across industries, unions, and entire cities. But he carried it as if it were nothing more than a whisper. The men around him still measured their success by blood spilled and streets conquered. Carlo measured his by how little he had to do to get what he wanted. The real victory, in his mind, wasn't to win wars. It was to make them unnecessary. He called it business over blood. The idea was simple, but in the world he lived in, revolutionary. Violence had once been the language of the Mafia. Every disagreement, every insult, every missed payment ended with a body in the gutter. But Gambino saw something that others didn't. Blood drew attention. Violence fed headlines. And headlines brought the law. Every dead man was another spotlight shining into their shadows. He wanted something else, something invisible, sustainable, civilized in its own way. He wanted the Mafia to run like a business that happened to be illegal. He sat in meetings that felt less like criminal councils and more like boardrooms. Capos discussed profits, not vendettas. Soldiers submitted reports instead of excuses. If there was tension between crews, it was handled in private, with calm conversation, often over espresso in some quiet restaurant backroom. The days of shouting and threats were gone. The men followed his lead because it worked. Under Carlo's philosophy, everyone made money, everyone stayed alive, and no one drew unnecessary heat. The FBI might circle the edges, but they could never find the center. To Gambino, power was a kind of mathematics. Every decision had a balance. He believed there were two kinds of losses, the ones you could recover from, and the ones that destroyed you. Violence, he said, always led to the second kind. Money, patience, and silence were recoverable. The trick was knowing when to spend which. If he could fix a problem with money, he paid it. If he could fix it with patience, he waited. And if neither worked, he didn't rage or panic. He simply made the problem disappear quietly, as if it had never existed. He surrounded himself with men who understood this rhythm. The soldiers who loved chaos, who craved the thrill of the gun, didn't last long. He had no use for them. But the ones who thought like him, the businessmen, the strategists, the quiet operators, those men rose high. They became his capos, his advisors, his legacy. He wanted thinkers, not killers. A bullet solves one problem, he once told a young lieutenant, but creates 10 more. Money solves all of them, and no one ever calls the cops on a paycheck. The results spoke for themselves. While other families fell into internal wars and FBI indictments, the Gambino family moved like a silent current beneath the city. They didn't make noise, but they made millions. Construction contracts, trucking routes, real estate developments. Everything was touched by their invisible influence. Workers got paid, projects moved forward, politicians got their donations, and everyone pretended not to notice the quiet man behind it all. He ran the family like an orchestra. Every note mattered. Every instrument had its place. When one section grew too loud, he silenced it. When one fell out of tune, he replaced it. To the men who worked under him, he was calm but terrifying. He never raised his voice, but his silence could freeze a room. It wasn't the fear of death he inspired. It was the fear of disappointment. You didn't want to fail Carlo Gambino because failure felt like being erased from the world, forgotten without even a whisper of explanation. He didn't smoke cigars or drink excessively like other bosses. He preferred espresso and conversation. His meetings were short, efficient, and often ended with a single nod. He had an uncanny ability to say everything by saying almost nothing. When others bragged, he listened. When others plotted, he observed. The less he spoke, the more they revealed. And when the talking stopped, he already knew exactly what to do. There were still moments when blood had to be spilled, and when those moments came, they were handled with surgical precision. No witnesses, no chaos, no drama. If someone had to die, it happened quietly, far from the eyes of the public. There were no grand gestures, no warnings, no revenge stories for newspapers to print. The death of a man in Carlo's world wasn't an event, it was an adjustment. What made his rule extraordinary wasn't just how long it lasted, but how stable it was. Under most bosses, the Mafia was a kingdom built on paranoia and betrayal. Under Carlo, it was a business of discipline. He taught his men that greed was the enemy of longevity. Never take everything, he said more than once. Take just enough that they want you to come back. It applied to everyone, businessmen, politicians, even rival families. By leaving something on the table, he ensured people kept inviting him to eat. That restraint made him untouchable. When the FBI began cracking down on organized crime in the early 60s, they came at him hard. They raided docks, wiretapped phones, flipped low-level informants. But all they ever found was clean paperwork, careful accounting, and men too afraid, or too loyal, to talk. He built layers of insulation around himself, so complex that no investigation could ever reach him directly. Even when his name surfaced, prosecutors could never make charges stick. They called him the ghost of Mulberry Street. He didn't hide. He just didn't leave fingerprints, even metaphorically. The press couldn't understand how a man of his influence could live so quietly. Reporters who managed to photograph him found a modest old man in plain suits, walking slowly beside his wife or sitting on his porch. There were no lavish cars, no expensive jewelry, no public arrogance. He lived like a man content with simplicity, even though every skyscraper that rose in New York somehow put money in his pocket. His philosophy extended even to his enemies. When conflicts arose with other families, Carlo never rushed to war. He'd invite his rivals to sit down, share a meal, and talk. If he could find even a small sliver of mutual interest, he'd exploit it. He understood that men, even dangerous ones, could be steered by comfort and gain more easily than by fear. Why kill a man, he once asked, when you can make him your partner? It wasn't morality. It was efficiency. Dead men couldn't make you money. He cultivated peace among the 5 families by balancing their greed. He ensured that no single boss grew too powerful, that no territory stayed in dispute too long. When the commission met, it wasn't a council of equals. It was a gathering of men orbiting his calm gravity. They respected him because he represented what they all wanted but rarely achieved: longevity. He had built a life where the police couldn't catch him, his enemies couldn't touch him, and even his friends couldn't fully understand him. As the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, Carlo's power only deepened. The world outside was chaotic: protests, assassinations, a changing culture, but his world stayed steady. He didn't adapt to the times. He made the times adapt to him. New industries rose, and he was their first. Las Vegas expanded, and his men were already in the casino unions. Construction boomed, and his companies won every major contract. The world thought it was evolving, but Carlo knew it was just another opportunity wearing a new disguise. He preferred invisibility to glamour. While other bosses flaunted wealth, he appeared almost ascetic. His Staten Island home was comfortable but unremarkable. He spent his evenings at the dinner table with family, talking softly in Sicilian, or sitting alone reading newspapers and sipping wine. Power, to him, wasn't something to enjoy. It was something to preserve. The moment you enjoyed it, you started losing it. He also understood that the law was no longer blind. The Appalachian fallout had forced the FBI to adapt. They watched, recorded, and infiltrated with increasing precision. Gambino's answer was to become quieter still. He stopped meeting in large groups, avoided phones altogether, and communicated through coded messages. Sometimes his orders were delivered through gestures or unspoken routines his men had learned to interpret over decades. He had turned secrecy into language. And still, the family prospered. Every new building in Manhattan had concrete poured by companies tied to him. Every union election had results he quietly influenced. The ports, the trucks, the warehouses, everything moved through channels he owned without ever having touched directly. He no longer controlled just men. He controlled momentum itself. But even a master strategist knows that no empire lasts forever. Carlo was aging. His once strong frame had grown frail, his breathing slower. Heart problems plagued him, and doctors warned him to rest. But rest was something he didn't understand. Every morning, he still reviewed reports, took quiet meetings, and checked the pulse of his world. His power was his rhythm, and stopping it would have felt like dying before he was dead. In private moments, though, he thought about legacy. He had built a system that could function without him, or so he hoped. He wanted to pass on not just his family, but his philosophy. He began teaching his nephew Paul Castellano and his son Thomas how to think the way he did, to make decisions without emotion, to weigh patience over impulse, to use money as a weapon sharper than steel. He told them that the Mafia's greatest enemy wasn't the FBI or rival gangs. It was vanity. Every man who wanted to be remembered ended up destroyed. The trick was to be forgotten while still alive. In the summer of 1971, a reporter asked an FBI agent why they hadn't been able to convict Gambino despite years of investigation. The agent replied, "Because he doesn't commit crimes. He just rearranges the world until crime happens to favor him. The line was meant as frustration, but it was also the truth. Carlo didn't fight the system. He became part of it, so completely that even when he broke the law, it looked like order. By the mid-70s, he was already a legend within his own lifetime. Men across the country whispered his name with reverence. Even his enemies and other families acknowledged his discipline. He had transformed organized crime into something closer to organized influence. The Mafia wasn't about blood anymore. It was about control. And control, in his hands, was absolute. Still, every night before he went to bed, he would sit by the window and look out at the city. The lights shimmered like restless stars. Somewhere in those streets, young men were already breaking his rules, chasing fast money, talking too loud, drawing too much attention. He could feel the next generation coming, reckless and impatient. They wouldn't understand what he had built. They'd tear at it, not out of malice, but ignorance. He couldn't stop that. He could only hope that the structure he'd built would outlast their foolishness. He once told a confidant, "Power is like glass. Handle it too hard, and it breaks. Handle it too soft, and it slips away." It was the essence of everything he'd ever done. He balanced his empire with the precision of someone who knew exactly how fragile it was. That was his genius, not just to build, but to preserve. By the time he entered his 70s, he rarely appeared in public. The Quiet Don had become quieter still. The FBI still followed him, still hoped for one slip, one mistake. It never came. They watched him walk slowly from his car to his house, saw him wave to his neighbors, heard nothing but small talk. They couldn't accept that a man could hold so much power without leaving a trace. But that was Carlo Gambino's final lesson. The greatest control is invisible. And so, in the twilight of his reign, as his health waned but his empire thrived, Carlo Gambino had achieved what every man before him had failed to do. He ruled without blood, commanded without fear, and turned silence into an art form. He had proven that the real weapon was not the gun or the knife, but the mind that knew when to use neither. The Quiet Don sat in his chair one evening, listening to the faint hum of the city he controlled, and felt something rare: peace. For the first time in decades, there were no fires to put out, no enemies to outthink, no storms to brace for. Everything was in order. Everything moved exactly as it should. He closed his eyes, knowing that sooner or later, time would come to collect what even the most patient men owe. But as long as the city kept moving to the rhythm he had set, as long as the docks still whispered his name, he would never truly be gone. Because Carlo Gambino had done the impossible. He had replaced fear with respect, violence with control, and noise with silence. He had made business the new blood of the Mafia, and in doing so, he had rewritten what it meant to be powerful. Chapter 11. The Rivals and the Enemies. In every empire, peace is only a mask that power wears when it's convenient. Carlo Gambino understood that better than anyone. For more than a decade, his calm rule had brought the Mafia into an age of quiet order. But beneath that calm, the same old instincts still burned: envy, ambition, fear. The underworld never stayed still for long. There were men who respected him, men who admired him, and men who smiled to his face while dreaming of his throne. It was inevitable. The Mafia wasn't built on loyalty. It was built on opportunity. The first real test came from a man who thought himself untouchable: Joseph Bonanno, head of one of New York's 5 families and a relic of the old world. Bonanno, like Gambino, had survived decades of blood and betrayal. He saw himself as a visionary, a reformer. He believed the Mafia should be passed down through family bloodlines, a dynasty like kings. But while Bonanno dreamed of monarchy, Carlo ruled through quiet democracy. He believed in balance. The commission existed for that very reason, to keep any one man from becoming too powerful. Bonanno, however, was tired of balance. He wanted control. In 1963, whispers began circulating through the underworld. Bonanno was plotting to eliminate his rivals on the commission, including Gambino, Lucchese, and Stefano Megadino of Buffalo. He had quietly aligned himself with Joe Magliocco, boss of the Prophesy family, promising a new order once their enemies were gone. They called it the plot against the commission. It was bold, it was reckless, and it was doomed from the start. The hitmen Bonanno and Magliocco hired were too nervous, too talkative. Word reached Tommy Lucchese first, and through him, it reached Carlo. When the news broke, Gambino didn't rage or panic. He just sat back in his chair, folded his hands, and said, "He made his move. Now he waits for mine." But his move wasn't war. It was patience. The commission convened an emergency meeting. Bonanno, sensing the danger, fled New York, claiming ill health and hiding in Arizona. Magliocco was left to face the wrath alone. He confessed everything, admitting Bonanno's plan to kill the bosses and take over the Mafia. The commission fined him heavily, but spared his life, out of respect for his age. Bonanno was stripped of power in absentia, his family divided among new leaders. His dream of domination died without a single shot fired. Carlo never spoke publicly about the incident. He didn't need to. The outcome spoke for itself. Every man in that room understood who had guided the decision, who had turned a plot for war into an opportunity for consolidation. Gambino had once again proven that silence was stronger than vengeance. He'd let his enemies destroy themselves while he simply waited for the dust to settle. But the Bonanno betrayal changed him. It reminded him that peace was fragile, that ambition could bloom even in the most disciplined men. After the plot, Gambino tightened his circle further. Only family and a handful of trusted capos had direct access to him. Everyone else was filtered through layers of intermediaries. He'd learned that familiarity bred danger. Even smiles could be weapons. The FBI, watching from the sidelines, believed the Mafia was finally tearing itself apart. They called it the Bonanno War, named after Bonanno himself. But Gambino wasn't fighting a war. He was building an empire immune to them. While the other families scrambled to repair their reputations, the Gambino family grew stronger. They filled the void left by Bonanno's collapse, taking over gambling operations, labor unions, and business fronts once under his control. What began as a betrayal turned into an expansion. Gambino's control wasn't just over money or men, it was over momentum. He had learned to turn every threat into a stepping stone. When rivals rose, he used their energy against them, like a man redirecting a river. He didn't crush opposition. He absorbed it. Not every enemy came from within New York. Outside the city, other bosses were rising, some too fast, some too loud. In Chicago, Sam Giancana had turned the outfit into a global power, entangling it with politics, the CIA, even Cuba. He was flashy, charming, too eager to mingle with celebrities and politicians. Carlo didn't trust men who loved the spotlight. The man who talks to presidents, he once said quietly, forgets how to talk to his own people. When Giancana's connections eventually exposed him, forcing him into exile, Gambino watched with the calm certainty of a man who'd seen this ending before. The same pattern repeated across the country. Bosses rose with ambition, only to fall under their own weight. In Detroit, Los Angeles, Kansas City, the cycle never stopped. Each time, Gambino learned something. Each downfall was a mirror reflecting what he refused to become. He understood that every rival was a warning dressed as competition. Still, not all opposition came from arrogance. Some came from desperation. There were men who'd lost everything: territories, soldiers, respect, and believed that taking from the Gambino family was their last chance at survival. Those men didn't last long, not because Carlos sent armies after them, but because he never had to. He'd created a network so deep that resistance was futile. Every business they touched already had his fingerprints on it. Every man they hired already reported to him. Fighting the Gambinos was like trying to breathe underwater. You didn't realize you were drowning until it was too late. But the most dangerous enemy wasn't a rival family. It was the government. After the Appalachian fallout, federal law enforcement had turned its full attention to the Mafia. J. Edgar Hoover, once dismissive of organized crime, now made it a national priority. The FBI launched new divisions, employing technology and tactics that had never been used before. Wiretaps, informants, surveillance. Nothing was sacred anymore. Gambino's empire, built on secrecy, was suddenly being watched from every angle. He responded not with fear, but evolution. He began withdrawing further into legitimate industries. He created distance between himself and anything explicitly criminal. His lieutenants took the risks, while he appeared as nothing more than an aging businessman managing real estate and trucking companies. The FBI could follow his money, but they couldn't prove intent. Every transaction, every deal, every handshake was cloaked in legality. He wasn't hiding from them. He was standing right in front of them, blending in so perfectly that the law no longer recognized the crime. They tried to flip his men. Some resisted out of loyalty, others out of terror. But Gambino knew that even silence had limits. Eventually, someone always broke. So he built redundancy into his system. No one man ever had enough information to destroy it. Each lieutenant knew only his piece of the puzzle, never the full picture. Even if one fell, the structure stayed intact. It was the closest thing to immortality the Mafia had ever seen. Despite the growing pressure, Gambino continued expanding. He forged alliances with the Lucchese family through marriage. His son Thomas married Lucchese's daughter, uniting two dynasties under one quiet bond. It wasn't just love, it was strategy. The Lucchese family controlled transportation and garment unions, while the Gambinos dominated construction and docks. Together, they formed the backbone of New York's labor economy. If you wanted to move a brick or a shipment, you paid tribute to them. If you wanted to avoid strikes, you went through them. The city functioned on their permission, and most people didn't even know it. Yet, even as his influence grew, Gambino never underestimated the danger of comfort. He'd seen too many men destroyed by it. Comfort made you slow. Comfort made you careless. He once told an associate, "When things are good, that's when the devil walks in." So he stayed vigilant, watching everyone, trusting no one fully. His enemies called it paranoia. His family called it survival. Through the late 1960s, cracks began appearing among the other families. The Bananos were fractured beyond repair. The Genovese family was leaderless after Vito's imprisonment and death. The Colombo family faced internal rebellion as younger capos challenged Joe Colombo's authority. Each crisis threatened to spill over into war, and each time, it was Carlo who stepped in to restore balance. He'd call meetings, not as a dictator, but as a mediator. He'd sit in the center of the table, letting the others argue until they exhausted themselves, then end the meeting with a single sentence that somehow solved everything. His influence grew beyond the Mafia. Judges, lawyers, businessmen, and politicians all came to rely on his quiet wisdom. He didn't bribe them in the traditional sense. He made himself useful to them, indispensable even. In time, many forgot he was a criminal at all. They saw him as a statesman of the underworld, a man who brought order to chaos. But Gambino never believed his own myth. He knew what he was, and he knew that behind every smile was still a knife. The only man he truly feared was time. His health had begun to falter. The chest pains came more often, the breathing slower, the steps shorter. But his mind stayed sharp, his instincts sharper. He watched his rivals die one by one. Men who had once seemed immortal. Luciano in exile, Genovese in prison, Costello fading into quiet retirement. Each passing left him more alone, the last of his kind. In those years, new enemies emerged, not from rival families, but from within his own ranks. Ambition was growing in men like John Gotti, younger soldiers who admired Gambino's discipline, but craved the fame he had always rejected. They wanted the world to know their names, to see their power. Carlo saw it coming like a storm on the horizon. He didn't fear it. He pitied it. The loud ones, he said softly once, always die first. Still, even the wisest man cannot stop the clock. By the early 70s, his doctors warned him that his heart was failing. He ignored them, continuing to meet with his capos, to oversee unions, to guide decisions from the shadows. He was no longer chasing power. He was preserving legacy. Every day was another lesson for the men he'd leave behind. Control without chaos, rule without noise. He looked around at his empire and saw rivals defeated, enemies buried, and peace holding steady. For once, he allowed himself the smallest measure of satisfaction. He had outlasted everyone who had ever challenged him. But he knew the truth. It wasn't victory. It was survival. And survival, in his world, was the closest thing to grace. Late one evening, as he sat in the quiet of his Staten Island home, he turned to his nephew Paul Castellano and said, "We built this on silence. Never forget that. The minute they start talking, everything we've done disappears." Paul nodded, absorbing the weight of those words, not realizing how prophetic they would one day become. Because Carlo Gambino knew that enemies never die. They just wait for silence to slip. And in the world he had shaped, silence was the only thing holding the darkness together. As the night deepened and the city lights flickered across the bay, Gambino felt a faint ache in his chest again. He smiled through it, whispering a line he'd carried from his youth in Sicily. Even a king needs no throne if no one dares challenge his shadow. And for now, no one did. The rivals were gone, the enemies quiet, the empire steady. But the shadow he had cast was long, and somewhere in its depths, the next generation of wolves was already stirring, drawn to the very power he had spent his life learning to conceal. Chapter 12. The Law Closes In. For years, Carlo Gambino had existed in the shadows so perfectly that the law began to question whether he even existed at all. He was a ghost in plain sight, a man who could move cities without ever leaving fingerprints. But by the late 1960s, the world around him had changed. The old rules of silence and invisibility were dying. Technology was evolving, the government was watching, and America's patience with organized crime was fading fast. The law, once blind, had finally learned how to see, and for the first time in decades, the quiet dawn could feel the gaze of the world narrowing toward him. It started slowly, at first just whispers. A new generation of law enforcement agents, young and restless, had grown tired of hearing stories about a man they couldn't touch. They called him the Phantom Godfather, and they made it their mission to find proof that he was real. They watched his every move, his home, his visitors, his family dinners. They followed him through Staten Island, through the quiet streets of Brooklyn, through the same docks that had once built his empire. Every week, the FBI filed reports full of nothing but descriptions of an old man walking, nodding politely, living like a saint. They didn't understand yet that this was exactly how he'd won all along. Still, the climate was shifting. After years of denial, the government had officially declared war on the Mafia. The Appalachian scandal had forced their hand, and the new generation of federal agents wasn't content to just watch. They wanted arrests. They wanted headlines. They wanted a victory. Edgar Hoover had changed his tune. Organized crime was now a clear and present threat to national stability. Task forces were built, wiretaps were authorized, and, for the first time, the FBI began to think like criminals. They studied the structure of the five families, learned their codes, their nicknames, their alliances. And at the top of every chart they drew, one name always appeared: Carlo Gambino. He watched all of it unfold with quiet amusement. While they built files and theories, he continued living the same routine. He woke up early, read newspapers with coffee, and met his men not in smoky backrooms, but on walks through the park or at his kitchen table. He spoke in riddles, never directly about business. "You water the garden," he would say, "but never tell the plants who owns the hose." His men understood perfectly, and the FBI tapes caught nothing but small talk about weather and health. The agents grew frustrated. To them, he was untouchable, not because of his muscle, but because of his discipline. But even ghosts cast shadows, and in those shadows, the law began to find openings. They started small, targeting his associates. They arrested lieutenants for tax evasion, capos for bribery, soldiers for illegal gambling. Every arrest came with the same question: where does the money go? And every time, the answer led nowhere. Carlo had built a system so insulated that even his closest men didn't know how far it stretched. When the government squeezed one arm of his operation, the rest kept moving. It was like trying to strangle smoke. The newspapers couldn't get enough of it. They called him the Invisible Don, the Untouchable, the Last Gentleman of Crime. Reporters staked out his house for photographs, desperate for anything. When they caught him stepping outside, he smiled politely, waved, and said, "Good morning." The next day's headlines would always sound the same. Mafia boss keeps silent. Gambino dodges law again. Each story only made his legend grow. But inside, Carlo felt the pressure. He'd built his life on calm control, and now the world was turning louder, faster, more chaotic. Younger gangsters were careless, flashing wealth, talking openly, drawing attention. He watched it all with disappointment. "They don't understand," he told Paul Castellano one night. "The noise that makes them famous will one day be the noise that buries them." The new generation wasn't raised in the old code of omerta. They were greedy, impatient, and worse, they were proud. Pride was poison. He'd spent 50 years avoiding it, and now it was creeping into his world through men too young to understand the danger of being seen. The FBI's next move was bold. They went after the unions. For years, Gambino had used the International Longshoremen's Association as both shield and sword. It was the artery through which his power flowed, connecting him to shipping companies, construction firms, and politicians. The government decided to cut off. They launched investigations into the docks, subpoenaed records, interrogated union leaders. The problem was, those leaders were loyal to Carlo, or too afraid to speak his name. Testimonies dissolved under silence. The law had built a perfect trap, but their prey refused to step inside. But the government wasn't done. They pivoted to tax evasion, following the same playbook they had used against Al Capone decades earlier. They combed through his finances, subpoenaed banks, tracked properties. And once again, they found nothing. His accounts were clean. His homes were legally purchased. His businesses, though suspiciously successful, were legitimate on paper. Every crime had been buried beneath layers of legality. Every bribe looked like a donation. Every payoff a consulting fee. The accountants finally gave up. "The man doesn't cheat," one investigator said in frustration. "He just wins." Through it all, Carlo never boasted. He didn't celebrate victories over the law, because to him, they weren't victories. They were reminders. The law wasn't his enemy. It was a force of nature, inevitable, unrelenting. You didn't fight the wind, you learned how to walk with it. That was his philosophy. He never tried to outsmart the FBI. He simply refused to play their game. But not everyone in his world shared that restraint. Across the country, new bosses were rising. Men like Joseph Colombo, who had formed the Italian-American Civil Rights League and brought mafia politics into the public eye. To Gambino, it was suicide. He warned Colombo to stop, to stay quiet. But the younger boss saw opportunity and visibility. The rallies grew larger, the press coverage bolder. In 1971, Colombo was shot in the head during a public event in Manhattan, collapsing on stage in front of television cameras. The crowd screamed. The news spread instantly. And Carlo, watching from afar, shook his head. "He forgot what business we're in," he said softly. "We're not in the business of being seen." The shooting of Colombo sent shockwaves through the five families. Suddenly, everyone remembered the old rule: attention kills. The FBI tightened its grip again, raiding union offices, questioning businessmen, arresting low-level operatives. The media swarmed every development, painting the Mafia as a decaying empire on the verge of collapse. But Carlo knew better. Decay wasn't death. It was adaptation. He withdrew further, cutting off risky ventures, streamlining his operations, and focusing entirely on legitimate fronts. While others crumbled under the pressure, he grew invisible again. And yet, even the calmest sea hides storms beneath it. Inside his own family, ambition was brewing. Younger capos wanted faster money, louder success. They admired Carlo but didn't understand him. They thought his patience made him weak. Men like John Gotti were already making names for themselves, climbing ranks with boldness and charm. They belonged to a different era, an era that no longer believed silence was strength. Carlo saw it coming, but he didn't interfere. He'd learned that every generation had to make its own mistakes. His only duty now was to prepare his family for what came next. The FBI, for all its failures, had one victory. They had changed the landscape forever. The Mafia could no longer hide behind the illusion of non-existence. It was now a fact, written in reports, broadcast on television, debated in Congress. The myth of invisibility was gone. But Carlo had adapted even to that. If the world wanted to see him, he gave them nothing to see. He continued living simply, quietly. Neighbors described him as kind, almost gentle. To them, he wasn't a crime boss. He was an old immigrant who loved his family and tended his garden. And in many ways, that was the truth. Beneath all the strategy, the wealth, the control, Carlo Gambino was still the boy from Cacamo who had learned that survival wasn't about strength, but about silence. By the mid-1970s, the law had thrown everything at him. Raids, wiretaps, informants, financial investigations. And still, he walked untouched. He had defied the system not through defiance, but through discipline. He'd made himself small enough to be invisible and wise enough to never rise too high above the noise. But the chase never stopped. He was 73 when the FBI once again tried to bring him in, this time on charges of conspiracy and racketeering. His lawyers fought it easily, and the case fell apart before trial. The agents watching him were exhausted. One of them, after years of tailing him, reportedly said, "The man doesn't run from us. He just walks slower until we forget why we're following." It was the perfect epitaph for his war with the law. By the time the last file was closed, Gambino had proven something extraordinary, that you could build an empire in full view of the world and still vanish completely. The law had spent decades trying to cage him, but they never realized that he'd never been inside their walls to begin with. He spent his final years in the comfort of his Staten Island home, surrounded by family, the law still circling but never landing. The newspapers stopped calling him the Phantom and began calling him something else, the last Don of the old world. And maybe he was. Because as the law closed in, Carlo Gambino had already found his escape, not through violence or flight, but through mastery of the one thing the law could never touch: silence. And in that silence, he remained undefeated. Frustration turned into obsession. Wiretaps were placed everywhere, on phones, in restaurants, even in the walls of union offices. They caught men talking about shipments, payoffs, deals, but never Gambino himself. His name was always avoided, replaced by vague phrases like the old man or the friend uptown. And even when agents were certain they'd finally heard something incriminating, the evidence fell apart in court. There was no signature, no recording, no paper trail. The Quiet Don had built his empire on air, and the law couldn't hold air in its hands. Still, Carlo wasn't invincible. The constant scrutiny began to wear on him. The stress showed in the lines on his face, in the way he moved slower, spoke less. He'd always been careful, but now his caution bordered on exhaustion. He rarely left home except for Sunday church or quiet meetings in safe houses. His circle grew smaller. His voice, though still calm, carried a tired edge. He was aging, and he knew it. But even in frailty, his control was absolute. His men feared his disappointment more than the law's punishment. In 1968, federal prosecutors tried a new tactic. They indicted him on charges of hijacking cargo shipments from Kennedy Airport. The evidence was thin, circumstantial, built mostly on the words of frightened witnesses and weak confessions. The trial became a media spectacle. Reporters flooded the courtroom, eager to see the mysterious Don finally cornered. When Gambino entered the room, dressed in a simple dark suit, the cameras clicked furiously. He sat quietly, expression unreadable, hands folded in his lap. The prosecutor spoke for hours, describing him as the puppet master of organized crime. Carlo didn't react. When his lawyer finally stood to speak, he simply said, "There is no evidence. Only legend. And legend wasn't enough. The jury took less than 2 hours to acquit him. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. "Mr. Gambino," one shouted, "how does it feel to be a free man?" Carlo smiled faintly. "I've always been free," he said, then stepped into his car and disappeared down the street. That single line summed up everything about him. Freedom wasn't about laws. It was about control. Chapter 13. Family Ties and Succession Plans. By the mid-70s, the quiet empire Carlo Gambino had built was no longer a secret. Everyone in law enforcement knew who he was, but no one could touch him. The FBI had files stacked to the ceiling with reports, wiretaps, photos, and witness statements. None of it mattered. Every move he made was clean, every decision perfectly measured, every conversation meaningless on paper, but loaded with implication between the lines. He had lived longer than any of his rivals. He had outsmarted the government, outlasted wars, and turned an empire of criminals into a system that ran like clockwork. But time, even for the quiet Don, was running out. His body was slowing down, his breath came shorter, and his heart, always calm, always steady, had begun to betray him. For the first time in his life, Carlo Gambino had to face a problem he couldn't plan his way out of. What would happen after he was gone? Succession had destroyed countless families before. Power was a magnet for chaos, and when a boss died without clear direction, blood always followed. Carlo knew this better than anyone. He'd seen it happen to Maranzano, to Anastasia, to Genovese, to dozens of bosses who believed their reigns would last forever. He would not make the same mistake. The Gambino family wasn't just his empire. It was his name, his legacy, his life's work. And he wanted it to survive him without spilling a drop of blood. His health had been fading quietly for years. The doctors called it bad heart, but to Carlo, it was simply the clock he'd always known was ticking. He refused hospitals, refused medication. A man who's lived by instinct shouldn't die by machine, he told his nephew Paul Castellano one evening. He spent more time at home now, reading newspapers on the porch, watching the world change around him. Television blared with stories of scandal, politics, and greed. He recognized the same hunger in those headlines that had driven every gangster he'd ever known. Only now it wore suits and gave speeches. The world wasn't getting cleaner. It was just getting better at pretending. He met with his inner circle less frequently, but chose his moments carefully. His nephew Paul was now his most trusted lieutenant, running much of the day-to-day operations. Paul Castellano was not like the old-school gangsters. He was deliberate, business-minded, and unemotional, a reflection of Carlo's own philosophy, but with sharper edges. Some in the family whispered that Paul was too cold, too detached from the streets. But Carlo saw something in him that others didn't. He saw continuity. Paul could take what he had built and keep it alive in an age that was shifting from crime to corporate corruption. He had other choices, of course. There was Aniello Delacroce, the family's underboss, a man respected deeply by the soldiers. Delacroce was a throwback to the older world, loyal, disciplined, and dangerous when necessary. He represented the traditional Mafia values of loyalty and blood. The men on the street loved him. But Carlo knew what that love could become after his death. Loyalty could turn to resentment if Delacroce wasn't chosen. And resentment in the Mafia was another word for war. For months, Carlo wrestled with the decision. Paul or Neil, that was how he referred to it privately. He walked the same streets of Staten Island at night, breathing in the cold air, feeling the weight of his choice pressing heavier with every step. He knew whichever man he chose, the other would have to be managed carefully. He'd spent his life avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. He wouldn't let his death cause it. He began building a delicate balance. Paul Castellano would take official control of the family's business interests, construction, unions, and the corporate front. But Delacroce would remain underboss, in charge of the men who worked the streets, ensuring their loyalty stayed intact. It was a compromise born out of precision. One man ruled the boardroom, the other the street, and between them stood the ghost of the man who'd built it all. He started shaping the transition quietly. There were no formal announcements, No meetings, no declarations. Just subtle shifts. Paul taking over key contracts, Delacroix handling the soldiers. Both men believed they were working in harmony, but only Carlo knew how thin the thread was that held them together. He met privately with both, one at a time, offering each his confidence, his blessing, and his warnings. "There's no empire worth dying for," he told Delacroix. "Keep the peace, and the money will follow." To Paul, he said something different. "You can't run a family like a business unless you understand it's still a family." Both men nodded, each hearing only what they wanted to. Beyond his inner circle, Carlo's family life remained steady. His wife, Catherine, had been his silent partner since the beginning, a woman who saw everything and said nothing. She never asked questions about his business, and he never brought a home. Their children had grown into adults, each carefully placed in legitimate roles connected to the empire. His son Thomas handled investments, keeping the family's wealth moving through banks and businesses that looked perfectly clean. His nephews managed smaller operations, but all roads led back to him. Even in retirement, his control was complete. Yet he couldn't ignore the changes around him. The mafia of his youth was gone. The code of silence was cracking, informants were multiplying, and law enforcement was getting smarter. Wiretaps were catching conversations that never should have existed, careless words from reckless men. Younger gangsters didn't understand discretion. They wanted power fast, fame faster, and when they got caught, they traded loyalty for leniency. Gambino despised it. "You can't build an empire with men who think prison is optional," he told Paul one night. He had spent decades perfecting invisibility, and now his successors would inherit a world where invisibility was dying. He could feel it slipping away, the old way, the quiet way. He sometimes wondered if he had built something too strong to survive change, or too delicate to withstand noise. Every night he sat by the window, listening to the hum of the city, and thought about legacy. What did it mean to leave something behind in a world where everything ended in betrayal? He remembered Sicily, the dust, the whispers, the way power was passed down not through choice, but through inevitability. In Cacamo, men didn't talk about inheritance. They just waited until the old ones were gone. That had been the way of the Mafia for centuries. But Carlo Gambino wasn't like the men of Cacamo anymore. He had built something larger, something that stretched beyond blood and land. His empire didn't live in fields or streets. It lived in systems, unions, and names written on legitimate contracts. It was modern feudalism, and he was its invisible king. But kings fall. The only question was how gracefully. In the summer of 1975, his health worsened. He began canceling meetings, relying on Paul and Delacroix to handle more business. He rarely left Staten Island anymore, spending his days between the garden, the porch, and the same small room where he read newspapers every morning. He could feel the world moving faster outside his walls. Men like John Gotti were rising now, loud, ambitious, reckless. They belonged to a new generation that believed power came from being seen. Carlo didn't hate them. He pitied them. "They think fear is respect," he told his wife one evening, "but fear fades. Respect lasts until you waste it." He knew his time was close. In his final months, he began putting things in order. He arranged quiet meetings with trusted allies across New York, securing promises, sealing alliances. He made sure that when he died, no one could use his name to start a war. He even spoke to leaders from other cities, urging them to honor his decisions about succession. Few would dare disobey. His word, even weakened by age, was law. One late autumn night, he called Paul Castellano to his home. They sat in silence for a long time, neither man speaking. Carlo looked tired, older than he'd ever appeared before. "Finally," he said, "when I'm gone, you'll have to carry the silence. It's heavier than power, but it lasts longer." Paul nodded, unsure how to respond. Carlo studied him for a long time. "You're smart," he said softly, "but don't forget what you are. They will forgive greed. They will forgive mistakes. They will never forgive arrogance." He didn't call Delacroix for a final talk. He knew there were some men who didn't need words. They already understood what silence meant. When Neil heard that Carlo had met with Paul privately, he didn't ask questions. He knew what it meant. He accepted it, quietly, as a man who understood that fighting a dying legend was worse than losing to him. In those final days, Carlo Gambino seemed at peace. He spent mornings tending to the small vegetable garden behind his house, afternoons sitting by the window, and evenings with family. He smiled more often, though it was a faint, faraway smile, like a man already half in another world. When the FBI agents parked outside his home saw him during their surveillance, they noted that he seemed frail, slow, harmless. They didn't realize they were watching the last chapter of the Mafia's golden age unfold in real time. On October 15th, 1976, Carlo Gambino died quietly in his bed from a heart attack. He was 74 years old. There were no bullets, no raids, no betrayals, just silence. He left behind the most powerful criminal empire in American history, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and a family that remained intact. His funeral drew hundreds of mourners, including capos, politicians, businessmen, and men of the cloth. The church overflowed with suits and whispers. Even the FBI showed up, cameras rolling from a respectful distance. They couldn't believe it. The most powerful mafia boss in America had died in peace. No violence, no blood, just the sound of footsteps and murmured prayers. After the burial, Paul Castellano officially took control of the family. Delacroce accepted the decision, though the divide between them would linger like a fault line beneath calm soil. For a while, the peace held. The empire continued to operate smoothly, the way Carlo had designed it. But everyone who had known the Quiet Don could feel it. The center was weaker without him. His silence had been the glue holding everything together. Without it, the cracks would grow. For now, though, the legend remained untarnished. Carlo Gambino had done the impossible. He'd lived as a ghost, ruled as a king, and died as a man. No courtroom ever convicted him. No assassin ever reached him. No rival ever toppled him. He had built a dynasty and passed it on without a drop of blood. That night, as the city moved on, lights flickering across the harbor, men who had served under him gathered quietly in bars, speaking his name with reverence. He was the last of the real ones, one said softly. And maybe he was, because in the end, Carlo Gambino had proved something timeless, that true power doesn't roar. It whispers, and long after the voice is gone, the echo of that whisper can still control the world. Chapter 14. The Legacy of Silence. The night after Carlo Gambino's funeral, a thick fog rolled across Staten Island, swallowing the narrow streets and muffling the sound of the city beyond. To those who had served him, it felt as if the world itself had gone quiet to honor the man who had spent a lifetime mastering silence. The quiet dawn was gone, and yet his presence lingered, in whispered stories, in the balance of power he had left behind, in the fear and respect he still commanded from men who were too young to have ever met him. His death didn't mark the end of an era. It marked the beginning of a test. The question wasn't whether the Gambino family could survive without him. The question was whether anyone could carry his silence long enough to keep his world from crumbling. For years, Carlo Gambino had been the invisible center of the Mafia's gravity. He never needed to shout, never needed to remind men who was in charge. His calm had been the glue that held together not just his own family, but the fragile peace among all 5 families. With him gone, that invisible order began to tremble. Paul Castellano had taken the throne, as Carlo intended, but his rule was different. Where Carlo led through restraint, Paul ruled through control. Where Carlo listened, Paul lectured. He wanted to modernize, to shape the Mafia into something more corporate, less about loyalty, more about efficiency. To outsiders, it looked like progress. To the men on the street, it felt like betrayal. They missed the old ways, the quiet nod, the subtle respect, the unwritten understanding that every man had his place. Carlo had ruled with an invisible hand, guiding rather than forcing. Paul's grip was tighter, colder. He wore tailored suits, dined with businessmen instead of capos, and filled his mansion with marble and chandeliers. The soldiers noticed. The underboss, Aniello Delacroce, noticed. And though he remained loyal, a storm was already forming in the cracks between them. It was a storm born from everything Carlo had warned about: the danger of arrogance, the illusion of control, the noise that came when silence was no longer sacred. But the deeper legacy of Carlo Gambino wasn't just in the empire he left behind. It was in the philosophy he had imprinted on an entire generation of men. He had shown that power didn't have to scream to be absolute. He'd taught that the greatest victories were the ones no one saw, that a man's strength wasn't measured in fear, but in patience. Even his enemies, men who'd tried and failed to destroy him, spoke of him with a strange kind of admiration. They didn't see him as just a mob boss. They saw him as a man who had turned crime into something closer to art, deliberate, precise, invisible. In the months after his death, the FBI doubled its efforts to dismantle what he'd built. They thought the empire would fall apart without its quiet architect. Instead, they found that his systems were stronger than ever. His influence still pulsed through the city like hidden electricity. The docks, the unions, the construction companies, all still moved according to plans he had drawn years before. The men he had chosen for leadership followed his structure so exactly that even federal agents admitted it was like chasing a ghost that left a map behind. Carlo's empire didn't collapse when he died because it had never been built around his presence. It had been built around his absence. Still, nothing lasts forever. Slowly, inevitably, the cracks widened. Paul Castellano's rule alienated the street soldiers who once revered the family's name. Men like John Gotti watched from below, their resentment growing in the shadows. They saw Castellano as weak, disconnected from the realities of the streets. They whispered that Carlo would never have hidden behind gates or dined with politicians while his men starved. Those whispers spread like wildfire, and within a few short years, the empire that had once been defined by its discipline was beginning to rot from within. But the fall of the Gambino family's silence didn't erase Carlo's legend. If anything, it made a myth. In the bars of Brooklyn, in the smoky backrooms of Little Italy, old men would tell stories about him in the kind of hushed tones reserved for saints or devils. They'd say, "Carlo didn't need to kill you. He just made you disappear." They'd talk about how he ran meetings where no one dared interrupt, how he could end a feud with a single look, how his calm could silence a room full of killers. Even younger mobsters who had never met him spoke his name with reverence. To them, he was the last Don who truly understood the balance between fear and respect. Outside the underworld, the media and the public became obsessed with him. Books were written, documentaries filmed, endless debates aired about how a man so quiet could have controlled so much. To journalists, he was a paradox, the humble crime lord, the invisible king. To law enforcement, he was a failure of justice, proof that discipline could outsmart the system. But to those who knew him, Carlo Gambino wasn't a mystery. He was a reminder of what the Mafia once was: organized, restrained, built on loyalty rather than chaos. His death marked the end of the old guard, and everyone who came after him was chasing a ghost they couldn't catch. In truth, Carlo's silence wasn't just a strategy. It was his shield. He had learned early that noise attracted danger. The loud men drew bullets. The quiet ones survived. He'd lived through Mussolini's Sicily, through Prohibition, through decades of blood and betrayal. Every step had taught him that the world belonged to the patient. His legacy, more than anything, was proof of that patience. He never rushed, never reacted, never let anger make his decisions. Even in war, he looked for the outcome that cost the least lives and made the most sense. To his men, it seemed cold. To him, it was mercy. But the irony of his legacy was that his very calmness created the chaos that followed. Without his quiet hand guiding the machine, the men who came after him couldn't hear the rhythm anymore. The system he'd perfected became too rigid for the world it existed in. The Mafia of the 70s and 80s was louder, brasher, more reckless. It had to be. The times demanded it. The drugs, the money, the hunger for fame, all of it pulled the underworld into a different kind of darkness. Carlo had built a fortress of discipline, but his successors turned it into a palace of greed. Paul Castellano's downfall in 1985, when John Gotti orchestrated his assassination outside Spark Steakhouse, was the final echo of Carlo's warnings. That single night shattered everything the Quiet Dawn had stood for. The murder wasn't just a power grab. It was a declaration that the new Mafia no longer cared about invisibility. Gotti, loud and flamboyant, became the anti-Gambino, a man who sought the camera instead of avoiding it, who dressed like a movie star instead of a businessman. To the public, he was fascinating. To the old guard, he was the end. Carlo's philosophy of silence had died with him. The empire he'd left behind had turned into theater. And yet, even as it burned, the foundation he'd laid refused to disappear. The systems of corruption he built were so deeply woven into the city that they survived long after the names changed. His methods, his way of merging the legal with the illegal, became the blueprint for every crime syndicate that followed. Politicians copied his patience. CEOs borrowed his ruthlessness. The modern world, in many ways, had become a reflection of his way of thinking. Power without noise, control without confrontation, victory without attention. He had taught not just the Mafia, but the entire nation, that influence was strongest when unseen. His family continued to live quietly, avoiding the spotlight he'd so carefully shunned. His widow outlived him by several years, fading into anonymity. His children stayed in business, maintaining a facade of legitimacy. Even decades later, investigators would find traces of his empire in real estate deals, shipping routes, and labor contracts. His presence was everywhere and nowhere, a ghost haunting the structure of American commerce. To the FBI agents who had spent their careers chasing him, his death felt like unfinished business. Some called it a victory. After all, the Quiet Dawn was gone. Others admitted privately that it was a loss. They had spent decades defining themselves by the pursuit of a man they could never catch. Without him, their war felt empty. In interviews years later, retired agents still spoke of him with reluctant admiration. One said, "Gambino didn't beat us with violence. He beat us with intelligence. He understood people better than we did." It was the closest thing to a confession the Bureau would ever make. Even now, historians argue over what made him different. Was it his intelligence, his discipline, his luck, or was it something simpler? The fact that he understood the one truth every other gangster ignored. That fear fades, but respect endures. In every photograph that survives of him, he looks calm, almost gentle, the kind of man you might mistake for a shopkeeper or a priest. That was his genius. He hid power behind humility. And when he left the world, he left it believing that was the only way to truly win. But the legacy of silence carries a shadow. The peace he built couldn't survive the noise that came after him. The Mafia became louder, bloodier, more desperate to hold onto a world that was slipping away. The FBI got stronger, the trials more public, the secrets harder to keep. The world Carlo Gambino had mastered no longer existed. Yet his lessons remained, echoing through history like a warning. Every man who rose too fast, every empire built on pride, every boss who thought himself untouchable, all of them eventually learned what Carlo had known all along. That real power doesn't need to be seen. It only needs to be felt. In the decades since his death, his story has taken on a strange kind of immortality. Hollywood turned him into a myth. Writers compared him to Machiavelli, to Caesar, to the great tacticians of history. They tried to explain his success, to decode his methods, to find a secret in his silence. But there was no secret. There was only discipline, something too rare to imitate and too simple to understand. That's why no one ever replaced him. And so the legend of the Quiet Godfather endures, not in the violence he avoided or the wealth he accumulated, but in the way he made the world bend without ever seeming to touch it. He had lived through the rise and fall of generations, navigated wars and betrayals, and still died in his bed, untouched, undefeated, unseen. His silence had outlasted bullets, investigations, and time itself. In the end, perhaps that was Carlo Gambino's greatest trick. Not escaping justice, but escaping history. Because history, like the law, loves noise. And he gave it none. On a quiet night, if you walk past the old docks of Brooklyn or the narrow streets of Little Italy, some say you can still feel him there. Not as a ghost, but as a presence. The stillness that settles after chaos. The calm that comes before a storm. The whisper that reminds you that some kings rule, even after death. Carlo Gambino's story began in the shadows of Sicily and ended in the heart of New York, but the silence between those two places became eternal. And long after the empires he built crumbled, long after the loud men who followed him burned themselves out in headlines and handcuffs, one truth remained. His kind of power never really dies. Because silence, once it learns how to rule, never stops speaking. Chapter 15. The Ghost That Never Died. It begins, as it always does, with silence. Decades after Carlo Gambino's death, the city that once moved to his rhythm still hums with the same quiet pulse he left behind. The docks of Brooklyn, the warehouses of Staten Island, the construction sites of Manhattan, all of them whisper with echoes of deals made long ago. His empire is gone, at least on paper. His name no longer appears in headlines. His photographs gather dust in FBI archives. And yet, in some invisible way, his presence remains. The ghost of the Quiet Dawn never truly left New York. He just changed shape, fading from man to myth, from memory to atmosphere. It's in the way businessmen shake hands over unspoken agreements, in the way politicians speak in circles when money changes hands. Carlo Gambino taught an entire world how to rule quietly, and that lesson outlived him. In the years following his death, the Mafia that had once feared and revered him began to implode. His successor, Paul Castellano, ruled with calculation but without warmth. His decisions were logical, but his arrogance was louder than his wisdom. The men on the streets grew restless. They remembered the days when their boss walked among them, when respect flowed naturally instead of being demanded. Castellano tried to lead like a CEO, but the Mafia was never built for corporate structure. It was built for blood and loyalty. The further he distanced himself from the streets, the more his men whispered about the old ways. And in every whisper, there was the same comparison. Carlo would have never done it this way. It's strange, the way legends become mirrors. In trying to follow him, Castellano only made his absence feel heavier. The balance that Gambino had maintained with patience and subtlety cracked under the weight of ego and ambition. His once peaceful empire became divided between those who believed in business and those who believed in power. The latter would win, as they always do when restraint disappears. And when John Gotti ordered the hit on Castellano in 1985, gunning him down outside Spark Steakhouse, it was more than just an assassination. It was a funeral for everything Carlo Gambino had built. The world he'd spent a lifetime protecting from noise exploded into chaos. The night Castellano's body hit the pavement, the news flashed across television screens, sirens wailed through Manhattan, and somewhere in the city, an old man might have whispered, "It's over." But not really, because while the men changed, the methods did not. Gambino's lessons had seeped too deeply into the city's veins. Even as Gotti became the Teflon Don, loud, brash, flashing diamonds and giving interviews, his operations still moved through the same invisible networks Gambino created decades earlier. The trucks, the ports, the labor unions, those systems didn't vanish with the man who built them. They were absorbed into the fabric of the city, impossible to untangle. The FBI, in their pursuit of Gotti, often found themselves tracing lines that led not to him, but to the ghost of the man who came before him. They'd open old files from the 50s and 60s, hoping to find connections that might explain how such an empire endured. Every thread they pulled led to the same conclusion. Gambino's genius hadn't been in crime itself, but in architecture. He had built something so structurally sound that even chaos couldn't collapse it. His organization was a design, not just a syndicate. It had layers, redundancies, protections. Even when one part fell, the rest kept moving. He had turned the Mafia into something closer to an ecosystem. And ecosystems, by nature, outlive their creators. But the more his successors failed, the more his legend grew. To young gangsters who came of age in the 80s and 90s, Carlo Gambino became less of a man and more of a myth. They studied his life like scripture, memorized his quotes, admired his restraint. Some called him the last true boss. Others saw him as proof that power didn't have to be loud to be absolute. But the truth was darker. Gambino's silence wasn't just wisdom. It was survival, born from a lifetime of watching men destroy themselves through greed. He wasn't kind. He wasn't merciful. He was efficient. And that efficiency had cost countless lives. Yet in death, those costs faded. Only the results remained, polished into legend by memory and nostalgia. Outside the underworld, historians began to see him differently too. Economists studied the Mafia's control over unions and industries and realized that Gambino's methods mirrored legitimate corporate tactics. The difference between a mob boss and a CEO, they noted, was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. He'd understood leverage, supply chains, and market manipulation long before Wall Street made them respectable. His empire had been illegal, yes, but it operated on the same principles that modern capitalism celebrated. Control the flow of goods, control the people who move them, and stay invisible while the money circulates. In some ways, the world had simply caught up to him. Even in law enforcement circles, his name carried an odd respect. Retired FBI agents who had chased him in their youth would shake their heads when asked about him. He never lost his temper, one said. He never left evidence, never made noise. You couldn't hate the guy. You could only admire how perfectly he played the game. To them, Gambino was a ghost story told in briefing rooms, a warning about the limits of power and patience. His family name, of course, lived on. The Gambino crime family continued to exist, though fractured, weakened, and constantly under federal surveillance. The media loved to use his name whenever a new arrest or trial occurred, as if invoking it could make sense of the chaos that came after him. But to those who truly understood the history, there was a clear line dividing everything that came before his death and everything that followed. Before Carlo, the Mafia was a shadow government. After him, it became theater, a spectacle of violence and vanity. And yet, his spirit lingered in the structure of things. Decades later, in the quiet corners of New York, there are still businesses that trace their ownership back through shell companies and partnerships that lead, indirectly, to men who once owed everything to Gambino. The city skyline itself is dotted with buildings funded through the same construction rackets he pioneered. Every brick, every beam, every poured foundation carries a trace of his invisible hand. The ghost of Carlo Gambino doesn't haunt the past, it haunts the present. Because the systems he built never stopped functioning. They just learned to blend in with everything else. But perhaps the truest proof that he never really died lies in the way people still talk about him. In documentaries, in books, in whispers over whiskey glasses, his name surfaces like a memory that refuses to fade. He represents something rare, the idea of control in a world that worships chaos. To those who live by the gun or the deal, his story is more than history. It's philosophy. They speak of him the way monks speak of saints, each story polished by reverence and fear. He never cursed. He never shouted. He never smiled unless he meant it. Stories like that don't just survive, they grow. Even Hollywood couldn't resist him. Films inspired by his life painted him as the archetype of the calm, calculating boss. Characters modeled after him appeared on screens for decades. Always the man in the corner, speaking softly while everyone else shouted. He became the template for power itself. Unseen, unemotional, unmovable. And maybe that was his real victory. Not that he escaped justice, but that he defined what power looked like long after the world changed around him. In truth, the ghost of Carlo Gambino isn't supernatural. It's psychological. He exists in every man who believes control can outlive mortality, in every leader who mistakes quiet for peace, every schemer who thinks patience guarantees survival. Because that was the lie even he couldn't escape. His silence bought him time, but time still won. The law never caught him, but death did. And yet, the illusion of permanence he left behind, the idea that one man could shape the world and then disappear, remains seductive. It's the same illusion that keeps empires rising and falling in cycles, each believing it's different from the last. But history has a sense of irony. In trying to vanish, Carlo Gambino became eternal. His death was supposed to be an ending, but instead it became the origin of his myth. Every generation that followed used his name as a benchmark for discipline, for patience, for quiet dominance. Even his enemies used him as a measure of what the Mafia once was and could never be again. He became the ghost every new boss tried to live up to, and every lawman tried to catch, even though he was already gone. If you walk through Brooklyn today, the neighborhoods have changed. The storefronts that once had gambling dens now sell coffee and luxury sneakers. The docks where longshoremen once whispered his name are quieter, automated, patrolled by security cameras instead of soldiers. The Mafia is no longer what it was, but the culture of quiet power he created still shapes the city's soul. The way deals are made, the way favors are traded, the way people avoid saying names. It's all a remnant of him. The ghost doesn't walk. It waits. Somewhere in an old FBI warehouse, there's a file marked Gambino, Carlo. Inside are hundreds of pages of reports, surveillance notes, and transcripts. The paper is yellowed, the ink faded, but one detail remains striking. Under the section labeled Final Assessment, an agent wrote, "He won without fighting." It's only 5 words, but they explain everything. Carlo Gambino's life was not about rebellion or conquest. It was about mastery, of self, of others, of silence. That's why his ghost endures. You can't kill an idea that hides inside behavior. There's an old Sicilian saying, "The man who controls himself controls everything." Gambino lived by that. It's what separated him from every other boss. When men threatened him, he stayed still. When they praised him, he stayed still. His calm was both armor and weapon, and that calm became his immortality. In the final analysis, his story isn't about crime. It's about human nature. It's about the eternal pull between noise and control, between those who seek attention and those who understand that attention is a trap. Carlo Gambino's empire fell, his successors died, the Mafia itself decayed, but the hunger for quiet power never went away. It lives in boardrooms, in politics, in backroom deals that still echo with the lessons he left behind. When you look at the city skyline at night, with its millions of glowing windows, it's easy to believe that power belongs to those in the light. But somewhere, deep in the structure of that city, there are still dark rooms where whispers move faster than sound, and silence still rules. That's where his ghost lives, not in the past, but in the spaces between words, in the moments before decisions, in the patience of those who know that true power doesn't need to announce itself. So maybe the ghost of Carlo Gambino isn't haunting us at all. Maybe we're still living inside the world he designed, a world that learned how to smile in daylight and scheme in darkness, how to speak without saying, how to move without being seen. This kind of power never ends. It simply changes shape, wearing new faces, new suits, new titles. And every time someone rises quietly, waits patiently, and wins without noise, the ghost stirs again. Because the quiet dawn never really died. He just learned the one trick no one else ever mastered. He became silence itself. And silence, unlike men, never fades. It waits forever.